The field of geology is usually a slow, methodical science. You spend your days looking at layers of rock, analyzing core samples, and measuring structural shifts that take millions of years to occur. It is a predictable discipline, rooted firmly in physical laws and historical proof. But for 41-year-old senior structural geologist Logan Vance, a core drilling project in the rugged wilderness of western Wyoming in the fall of 2018 would turn his understanding of the Earth completely upside down. He and his team would find out that when you drill deep into the untouched crust of the planet, you aren't just uncovering history. Sometimes you are opening a door. The setting for the story is the Wind River mountain range, an isolated, brutal expanse of granite peaks, deep glacial canyons, and dense pine forests. It was the 14th of September 2018, a day where a sudden alpine cold front had pushed down from the mountains, dropping the temperature below freezing and causing a thick, freezing mountain mist to settle over the drilling site. Logan was leading a 4-person research team under a federal grant to assess the structural integrity of a deep granite fault line. The team included a drilling technician named Chloe, an acoustic engineer named Marcus, and a graduate student. They were operating a massive automated diamond head core drill mounted to the back of a heavy utility truck positioned in a remote rock-strewn basin about 8 miles from the nearest dirt logging road. By 4:15 p.m., the drill had been running continuously for 6 hours, its heavy mechanical rumble echoing off the steep granite walls of the basin. The drill head had penetrated exactly 1,200 feet into the solid granite bedrock, pulling up cylindrical tubes of gray stone that Chloe carefully cataloged and stacked in wooden crates inside their main command tent. At exactly 4:32 p.m., the drill's automated safety system suddenly triggered, causing the entire utility truck to shake violently before the mechanical hum died out completely, leaving the basin in a sudden, deafening silence. Logan stepped out of the command tent, his boots crunching against the frozen gravel, and approached the rig. Chloe was already looking at the digital control panel, her face pale in the pale light of the display screen. She told Logan that the drill head hadn't jammed against hard quartz. It had dropped. The sensor reading showed that at precisely 1,204 feet, the diamond bit had punched through the solid bedrock into a massive, completely unmapped subterranean void. A void at that depth in solid granite was geologically impossible. Intrigued, Logan instructed Marcus to lower a specialized high-definition borehole camera down the shaft. The camera was attached to a heavy spool of fiber optic cable, equipped with an array of ultra-bright LED lights and a highly sensitive directional microphone meant to pick up seismic vibrations. For 10 minutes, the team stood inside the dark command tent, watching the video monitor as the camera descended down the narrow 4-inch-wide borehole. The screen showed nothing but the smooth, gray, vertical walls of drilled granite passing by at a steady pace. 1,200 feet, 1,201, 1,203. Then, the gray stone walls vanished. The camera broke through the ceiling of the void, entering a vast, pitch-black space. The ultra-bright LED lights cut through the darkness, but they couldn't find the floor or the walls of the chamber. The void was immense, an underground abyss that defied any geological explanation. Marcus adjusted the acoustic audio feed, turning the volume up on the tent's monitor speakers. At first, there was only the faint, high-pitched hiss of static. But as Logan stepped closer to the screen, the static was replaced by a sound that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. It was a low, rhythmic vibration. It sounded exactly like the wet, slow, heavy breathing of an incredibly large pair of lungs. Logan frowned, telling Marcus to check for a technical malfunction or a wind tunnel effect from the surface. But before Marcus could touch the audio dial, the camera's video feed flickered violently. The camera had descended 20 feet into the void when the directional microphone picked up a new sound. It was a sharp, dry, rapid clicking noise. It sounded like bone chattering against bone at an impossible speed. Then, the camera's automated motion tracker triggered. The digital green box on the monitor screen snapped toward the very edge of the light beam, focusing on something that was rising up from the darkness below the lens. Logan leaned forward, his hands gripping the edge of the metal table. Emerging into the blue-white glare of the borehole lights was a face. It was immeasurably long and emaciated, its gray, leathery skin stretched so tight over the skull that the white bone structure underneath was visible through the flesh. It had no nose, no ears, and its unhinged jaw was wide open, sliding rhythmically from side to side to create that horrific clicking sound. But what made Logan's blood turn to ice were the eyes. They were two massive, glassy black orbs that completely reflected the LED lights, staring straight up the narrow 4-inch shaft directly into the camera lens. The creature didn't just look at the device. With a fluid, terrifying velocity, it raised a long skeletal arm, its multi-jointed fingers ending in sharp black claws, and gripped the camera housing. The monitor screen exploded into green static, and the fiber optic cable on the heavy spool outside began to spin backward with a violent, snapping force as if something in the deep dark was pulling the line down. Marcus screamed, reaching out to hit the manual emergency cutoff switch. The cable snapped with a loud report, the loose end whipping through the air and tearing a gash into the fabric wall of the tent. Logan stood paralyzed, the sound of the creature's wet, chattering, still echoing faintly through the dead speakers. He looked at Chloe, whose eyes were wide with pure survival terror. He told the team to abandon the equipment, get into their secondary transport SUV, and drive back to the ranger station immediately. They scrambled out of the tent into the freezing mountain mist. The darkness had fully settled over the Wind River Basin, the towering granite peaks silhouetted against a starless sky. As Logan reached the driver's side door of the SUV, he stopped. The heavy-core drill rig, mounted to the utility truck 50 feet away, was shaking. The thick steel stabilizers dug into the frozen ground were groaning under an immense upward pressure. From inside the narrow 4-inch borehole on the ground, a low, wet, rhythmic chattering sound began to rise, vibrating through the solid stone of the basin. The entity wasn't staying down in the void, it was climbing the shaft. The steel stabilizers of the drilling truck gave out with a deafening metallic snap, the heavy frame of the vehicle listing violently to the right as the ground beneath it began to buckle. Logan did not hesitate. He threw open the SUV door, screaming at Chloe and Marcus to get in. They dove into the back seat just as a thick, viscous cloud of gray dust and putrid air erupted from the open 4-inch borehole, smelling sharply of sulfur, copper, and ancient rot. Logan slammed his foot onto the accelerator, the tires screaming against the frozen gravel as the SUV lunged away from the drilling site. Through the rearview mirror, under the pale glow of the vehicle's reverse lights, Logan watched the drilling rig. The heavy steel drill pipe, which extended 1,200 feet into the earth, was being pushed straight out of the ground. It rose like a massive skeletal finger, bending and snapping under an impossible upward force from below. And then the truck itself was flipped completely onto its side as the earth around the borehole fractured open. Logan accelerated down the narrow, unpaved logging road, the headlights cutting through the thick mountain mist. The road was a treacherous labyrinth of sharp switchbacks and steep drops, but he drove with a frantic, reckless speed, completely consumed by the need to put distance between his team and that basin. In the back seat, Marcus was hyperventilating, his hands clamped tightly over his ears as if he could still hear that wet, rhythmic clicking echoing through the air. Chloe was staring out the back window, her body shaking violently in the chill of the cabin. They drove for 45 minutes in absolute silence, the SUV bouncing brutally over the ruts in the dirt road before finally hitting the paved surface of Highway 191. Logan didn't stop at the local ranger station. He drove straight to the Sublette County Sheriff's Department in Pinedale, Wyoming. The responding deputies took their statements in separate interrogation rooms. The story sounded completely insane, a 7-foot, emaciated creature climbing out of a 1,200-foot deep borehole in solid granite. But Logan's status as a senior geologist and the sheer physical trauma visible on the faces of his team forced the sheriff to take the report seriously. At dawn, a tactical sweep team consisting of 6 armed deputies and 2 federal land rangers escorted Logan back to the remote basin to secure the government property and assess the site. When the caravan of vehicles rounded the final ridge and entered the rock-strewn basin, the scene was completely dead. The mountain mist had cleared under the morning sun, revealing the true extent of the destruction. The heavy utility truck was resting on its side, its chassis twisted and broken. The automated core drill was completely destroyed, the diamond head bit shattered into hundreds of pieces across the gravel. But what the federal investigators discovered when they approached the actual borehole is what caused the entire project to be classified under an immediate national security protocol. The 4-inch hole in the granite bedrock was no longer 4 inches wide. The solid ancient stone had been violently widened from the inside out, fractured into a jagged 3-foot-wide chasm. The interior walls of the upper shaft were covered in deep, parallel gouge marks that had cut straight through the solid rock, as if something with diamond-hard claws had dug its way up the 1,200 feet of vertical granite. Furthermore, when the forensics team analyzed the command tent, they found Marcus's digital monitor screen resting on the metal table. The glass wasn't just cracked, the surface had been deeply etched from the outside with a single repetitive pattern. When the technicians ran a light scanner over the etched glass, they realized it formed a crude, terrifyingly precise anatomical drawing of a human heart, with a small X marked right in the center of the left ventricle. The entity that climbed out of the Wind River void has never been captured or sighted since that morning. Within 48 hours of the incident, a convoy of unmarked federal vehicles arrived at the basin. A specialized engineering crew poured 40 tons of industrial-grade liquid concrete directly into the fractured chasm, sealing the entrance to the void under a massive, reinforced block that was subsequently buried under hundreds of tons of loose granite boulders. The federal grant was canceled, the geological data was seized, and Logan and his team were forced to sign strict, lifetime non-disclosure agreements. Logan Vance never looked at a core sample again. He resigned from his university tenure, sold his home in Wyoming, and moved to a small coastal town in southern Florida, where the geology consists entirely of shallow sand, coral reefs, and water, a place where the deep, dark interior of the earth cannot be reached by a drill. He managed to build a quiet, isolated routine, but the psychological weight of that autumn afternoon remains completely unhealed. He refuses to enter basements, he cannot tolerate the sound of mechanical drilling of any kind, and he uses an electronic noise-canceling system in his bedroom just to sleep. Because according to Logan, the true horror of the experience isn't the memory of the creature's face or the static on the screen. The true horror lives in the realization of what is happening beneath our feet. Every time he feels a slight tremor from a passing truck or hears the low hum of distant machinery, his body freezes. He realizes that humanity is just living on a thin, fragile crust of reality, completely unaware that deep within the ancient, untouched foundations of the world, something else is breathing, chattering its teeth, and waiting for us to drill the next hole. The allure of commercial show caves is that they offer a perfectly sanitized version of the underground world. When you pay for a ticket at a state park or a private cavern attraction, you expect paved pathways, handrails, and bright, colorful lights illuminating the rock formations. It feels like a museum, completely safe and entirely controlled by the staff. But for 26-year-old seasonal tour guide Tristan Vance, a late-night closing shift at a popular show cave in southern Indiana in the summer of 2016 would reveal that a simple metal gate and a warning sign are not always enough to keep the unknown at bay. He would learn that when you hear a sound coming from a part of the cave that has been closed to the public for over 50 years, you do not go looking for the source. The setting for this story is the Squire Boone Caverns, located just outside of Corydon, Indiana. It was the 24th of August, 2016, a night where the Midwestern summer heat was intensely oppressive, making the air outside heavy with humidity and the smell of dry cornfields. Inside the caverns, however, the temperature sat at a constant, chilling 54 degrees, creating a thick, ghostly mist where the warm surface air met the cold breath of the subterranean tunnels. Tristan was a local college student who worked the summer shifts to pay for his tuition. He was a practical, easygoing guy who knew the history of the caverns by heart, from the early pioneers to the specific geological formations. He carried a standard-issue heavy plastic flashlight, a keyring with master passes, and a two-way radio clipped to his belt. He didn't believe in the ghost stories the older guides liked to tell the tourists. To him, the cave was just a job. Around 9:15 p.m., the last commercial tour group had exited the gift shop and the main entrance doors were locked. Tristan was tasked with the final sweep of the public trails, a routine procedure to ensure no stray tourists had stayed behind to take extra photos. He walked along the illuminated concrete pathway, turning off the massive breaker switches section by section, plunging these spectacular stalactite chambers into a deep, velvety darkness behind him. At exactly 9:42 p.m., Tristan reached the deepest section of the public route, a wide chamber known as the Rock of Ages. At the far back of this room, hidden away from the main path by a low limestone ledge, sat the entrance to the Forbidden Tunnel. It was a narrow, unpaved passage that led into an unstable, flooded network of the aquifer. The entrance was blocked by a heavy, rusted iron gate, secured with a thick chain and a bright red sign that read, "Danger, do not enter, collapse hazard." Tristan stood by the breaker panel, his hand resting on the final plastic switch that would turn off the lights for the entire lower chamber. The silence in the room was immense, total and absolute, broken only by the steady, rhythmic rush of an underground waterfall cascading into a deep pit somewhere nearby. Then, from the absolute darkness behind the rusted iron gate of the Forbidden Tunnel, came a sound. It wasn't the dripping of water, and it wasn't the low groan of settling stone. It was a voice. It sounded like a woman, her tone incredibly flat, distant, and mechanical, repeating a single phrase over and over again. "Help me, help me, help me." The intonation never changed. It didn't rise or fall, sounding less like a person in distress and more like a low-quality audio recording playing on a loop. Tristan froze, his heart giving a sudden, violent thud against his ribs. His first thought was that a tourist from the previous group had climbed over the limestone ledge, slipped past the gate, and fallen into the unstable shaft. He pulled his heavy flashlight from his belt, clicked the button, and directed the bright white beam straight through the iron bars of the gate. The white light cut through the heavy mist inside the tunnel, illuminating the muddy floor, the jagged limestone walls, and the rotting wooden supports from an old 1960s exploration project. The tunnel was completely empty. There was nobody there. Tristan stepped closer to the gate, his boots crunching loudly against the gravel. He pressed his face against the cold iron bars, shouting into the darkness, asking if anyone was hurt. The moment his voice echoed down the passage, the mechanical chanting stopped. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. Tristan held his breath, listening intently, his eyes scanning the wet clay floor inside the gate. He noticed a series of deep, parallel tracks in the mud, as if something heavy had been dragged backward into the dark recesses of the tunnel. Then, from about 30 feet deep inside the Forbidden Tunnel, past the reach of his flashlight beam, came a new sound. It was a sharp, dry, rapid clicking noise. It sounded exactly like bone chattering against bone at an impossible speed. Click, 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 click. And as Tristan watched, in absolute, unadulterated horror, the two massive, glassy black orbs materialized out of the dark, hovering just 2 feet above the muddy floor. The creature was crouching on all fours, its gray, emaciated torso compressed flat against the ground, its thin neck twisted at a horrific 90-degree angle. Its upside-down face was staring directly into his flashlight lens, its unhinged jaw wide open as a clear, viscous fluid dripped from its calcified ridges into the mud. The creature didn't make a sound from its throat. It simply shifted its weight and launched its 7-foot frame forward, its long, double-jointed limbs propelling its body through the narrow tunnel with an insect-like velocity, heading straight for the iron gate where Tristan was standing. Tristan did not think. He dropped his two-way radio, spun on his heel, and slammed his hand onto the final breaker switch. The entire lower chamber of the Rock of Ages was instantly plunged into a deep, pitch-black darkness, save for the single, trembling beam of his plastic flashlight. He bolted up the concrete pathway, his sneakers skidding violently against the wet, smooth surface. The handrails blurred past his left hand as he threw his body up the steep incline, his chest heaving with a frantic, desperate energy. Behind him, a horrific, metallic impact echoed through the chamber. Clang! The creature had slammed its 7-foot frame directly into the rusted iron gate. The sound of the thick chains snapping and the iron hinges tearing out of the ancient limestone wall reverberated off the cavern's ceiling like a gunshot. The entity was out of the forbidden tunnel. Now, the sound of the pursuit was closing the distance with terrifying speed. It was a rapid, four-legged scrambling, a succession of solid, wet impacts against the concrete trail. Thump, 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 thump. The creature's long, double-jointed limbs were propelling its emaciated body up the steep incline with an absolute insect-like velocity, completely unbothered by the slope. Tristan reached the stairs leading to the middle level, a narrow section where the trail twisted through a tight, low-ceilinged passage called the Needle's Eye. He ran with his head ducked down, his flashlight beam bouncing frantically off the wet stone walls. As he rounded a sharp bend, his foot caught the edge of a concrete step. He went down hard, sliding across the rough stone floor, his flashlight flying out of his hand and bouncing into a deep, flooded crevice beside the path. The light did not break. It settled at the bottom of the water, pointing upward, illuminating the entire narrow passage in a pale, ghostly blue-green glow. Tristan scrambled to get his feet under him, but his right knee was badly scraped and throbbing with a sharp, white-hot pain. He looked back down the steps. Crouching at the bottom of the short flight of stairs, fully caught in the upward glow of the submerged flashlight, was the entity. Its gray, leathery torso was compressed completely flat against the concrete, its thin neck elongated and twisted at that horrific 90-degree angle. Its upside-down face was fixed directly on Tristan's eyes, its unhinged jaw wide open as a thick, clear string of fluid dripped from its calcified ridges onto the path. The creature raised one of its long skeletal arms, its black claws scraping against the concrete step with a slow, agonizing shriek. Screech. Then it opened its mouth wide and the voice came out again. It was the exact same flat, mechanical female tone Tristan had heard earlier, but this time it didn't say, "Help me." It repeated Tristan's own full name over and over in that identical dead loop. Tristan Vance. Tristan Vance. Tristan Vance. The sheer psychological terror of hearing his own name echoed back to him by an impossible entity broke Tristan's mind. With a breathless scream, he dragged his body upward using the steel handrails, forcing his injured leg to move as he lunged through the exit tunnel toward the upper level. He burst through the final security door into the back room of the commercial gift shop, slamming the heavy reinforced steel door shut behind him and throwing the deadbolt into place. He collapsed against the metal, his heart hammering so violently against his ribs he was certain it would give out. From the other side of the thick steel door came a single heavy thud. Thump. Then, the dry, rapid chattering of bone against bone echoed faintly through the metal frame, followed by the soft, wet sliding of flesh as the creature descended back into the dark depths of the public cavern. Tristan was found by the morning shift manager at 7:30 a.m., curled into a tight ball in the corner of the locked gift shop, his clothes covered in cave mud, his eyes wide, vacant, and completely unblinking. The Indiana State Police and the Harrison County Sheriff's Department launched a full investigation of the Squire Boone Caverns over the weekend. A tactical sweep team consisting of 4 armed officers and a subterranean safety engineer moved through the lower levels with high-powered searchlights and shotguns. When they reached the Rock of Ages chamber, they found the entrance to the Forbidden Tunnel completely open. The heavy iron gate had been ripped entirely off its mountings, the thick steel links of the chain snapped in half. But what the state cave inspectors discovered when they used a specialized, high-resolution laser scanner to map the interior of the Forbidden Tunnel is what caused the entire lower section of the commercial park to be permanently condemned. The unpaved tunnel didn't just lead to an unstable aquifer, it connected to a massive vertical shaft that plunged hundreds of feet into the deep, unmapped foundations of the state's cave system. And when the technicians analyzed the laser imagery of the vertical shaft, they realized the limestone walls were completely covered in thousands of the long, five-fingered claw marks. The tracks didn't just stay in the dark. When the police reviewed the audio from Tristan's dropped two-way radio, which had recorded the entire incident from the floor of the chamber, they discovered that the mechanical female voice wasn't an audio loop. The frequency analysis showed that the creature was mimicking the exact vocal cords of a local high school student who had disappeared in the surrounding woods in the summer of 1985. Meaning the entity had been observing, learning, and waiting in the forbidden spaces of the park for over 30 years. The management of Squire Boone Caverns permanently sealed the entrance to the lower chambers 3 weeks later. A specialized engineering crew used 5 tons of industrial concrete to wall off the Rock of Ages chamber completely, erasing the forbidden tunnel from all future tourist maps and brochures. Tristan Vance never finished his college degree, and he never entered an underground structure again. He packed his clothes into his car, left the state of Indiana, and moved to a newly constructed concrete slab home in the high, sun-baked desert of Moab, Utah, a place where the ground is solid rock, the sun is blindingly bright, and there are absolutely no trees, no mist, and no caves. He managed to rebuild a quiet daytime routine, but the psychological scars of that August night remain entirely unhealed. He refuses to enter any building with a basement, he cannot tolerate the sound of a looping audio track, and he leaves every light in his home turned on 24 hours a day. Because according to Tristan, the true horror of the experience isn't the memory of the chase or the creature's upside-down face. The true horror lives in the realization of what is listening to us. Every time he hears a distant, flat voice on a crowded street, or a faint, rhythmic chattering sound from a vent, his entire body goes completely rigid. He realizes that you can be completely safe, surrounded by family and modern comforts, entirely unaware that just a few feet away, behind a simple metal gate or a warning sign, something impossible is sitting in the absolute dark, learning your name and waiting for you to listen. The appeal of amateur spelunking, or cave exploring, is that it allows regular people to become true pioneers. In a world where almost every square inch of the surface has been mapped by satellites, the deep underground remains one of the last places on Earth where you can step into a room where no human eye has ever looked before. But for 29-year-old high school biology teacher Brandon Cole, a weekend trip into the rugged wilderness of eastern Kentucky in the spring of 2022 would turn into a stark reminder of why some spaces were left unmapped. He would discover that being the first person to enter a cave doesn't mean you are the only thing inside it. The setting for this story is the Daniel Boone National Forest, a massive expanse of dense woods, steep sandstone cliffs, and thousands of hidden limestone sinkholes. It was the 23rd of April 2022, a damp, foggy Saturday where the spring rain had finally stopped. But the forest floor remained soaked, smelling heavily of wet moss, decaying leaves, and cold mud. Brandon was not a reckless adventurer. He was a methodical, careful guy who spent his free time documenting wild orchid species and mapping minor cave entrances for a local conservation group. He was incredibly fit, carried top-of-the-line gear, and always let the local ranger station know his general coordinates before heading out. Around 1:30 p.m., Brandon was navigating a steep, rocky ravine about 4 miles off the main hiking trail when he noticed a strange anomaly in the hillside. Hidden behind a thick curtain of tangled wild blackberry briars and overgrown ferns was a narrow horizontal fissure in the limestone rock. The opening was only about 3 feet wide, but a steady, surprisingly cold blast of air was blowing out from the darkness inside, indicating that the fissure connected to a substantial underground chamber. Brandon felt that familiar surge of excitement. He pulled out his rugged digital camera, turned on his primary high-powered headlamp, and dropped to his knees. He slid his backpack ahead of him, maneuvering his torso through the tight, muddy gap. The rock was sharp, tearing at his canvas jacket, but after a few yards of tight crawling, the ceiling suddenly vaulted upward. He stood up, brushing the wet clay from his knees, and shined his light around. He was standing in a majestic, pristine limestone cavern that dropped down at a sharp angle. The air was dead, heavy, and incredibly crisp, registering at a constant 55 degrees. The only sound was the slow, rhythmic ping of water droplets falling from distant stalactites and hitting the stone floor somewhere in the dark. For the next 2 hours, Brandon moved deeper into the cave system, completely fascinated. He followed a dry, ancient underground riverbed that twisted and turned through 3 massive chambers, each one larger than the last. He took dozens of high-definition photos of rare geological formations, his camera flash exploding with brilliant bursts of white light that briefly illuminated the ancient stone walls before plunging them back into the blue-white beam of his headlamp. At exactly 3:42 p.m., Brandon reached what appeared to be the absolute end of the cave system. He entered a long, narrow gallery that resembled a subway tunnel. The floor was covered in smooth, dark river pebbles, and the walls tapered inward until they terminated in a solid, vertical wall of jagged limestone. Brandon walked to the very back of the gallery, stopping about 10 feet away from the terminal wall. He set his backpack down on the pebbles, pulled out a fresh bottle of water, and decided to take one final panoramic photograph of the room before starting the long trek back to the surface. He raised his heavy DSLR camera to his eye, dialed the shutter speed down to allow for a long exposure, and pressed the button. The powerful external strobe flash mounted on top of the camera popped with a deafening electric crack, illuminating the entire back wall of the cave with a light as bright as the midday sun. The light vanished instantly, returning the room to the narrow beam of his headlamp. Brandon smiled, looking down at the small LCD preview screen on the back of his camera to check the exposure of the shot. As the digital image rendered on the screen, Brandon's breath caught sharply in his throat. The photograph was crystal clear. It showed the smooth pebble floor, the dark limestone walls, and the vertical rock face at the dead end. But standing precisely in the far left corner of the terminal wall, completely hidden within a deep shadow that his headlamp had missed, was a shape. It wasn't a rock formation. The geometry was entirely wrong. It was a towering, skeletal figure, standing well over 6.5 feet tall. The entity was completely naked, its skin a dull, bruised gray color that looked slick, oily, and completely hairless. It was pressed tight into the corner, its long, emaciated limbs folded inward against its torso like a compressed insect. But what made Brandon's blood run completely cold was its posture. The creature's neck was unnaturally elongated, its head tilted downward at a horrific 90-degree angle, staring directly across the empty room toward the camera lens. It had no visible nose or ears, just a smooth, pale skull. But where the eyes should have been, the camera flash had caught the distinct white reflection of 2 massive glassy orbs. Brandon stood perfectly paralyzed in the silent gallery, the small screen of the camera illuminating his face in a pale blue glow. His logical mind tried to reject it. He told himself it was an optical illusion, a strange combination of iron deposits and shadows on the limestone wall. He slowly raised his head, his hands shaking violently as he directed the bright blue-white beam of his headlamp toward the far left corner of the back wall. The corner was empty. There was nothing but jagged gray stone and a small pool of shadow. Brandon let out a ragged, trembling breath, trying to calm his racing heart. He reached down to pick up his water bottle, his eyes still fixed on the empty corner. Then, the dead silence of the subterranean gallery was broken by a sound. It didn't come from the ceiling, and it didn't come from the tunnel behind him. It came from directly inside the solid limestone wall in the back of the cave. It was a low, dry, rhythmic scraping sound, like heavy bone dragging slowly across rough concrete. Scrape, pause, scrape, pause. And as Brandon watched in absolute, unadulterated horror, a narrow vertical crack in the stone wall, a fissure that was barely 4 inches wide, began to flex. The solid limestone groaned under an immense, impossible pressure, and a long, pale, multi-jointed finger, ending in a sharp black claw, slowly pushed out from the darkness inside the mountain. The single, pale finger hooked around the edge of the narrow rock crack, its black claw digging into the soft limestone with enough force to send a small shower of white stone dust clattering down onto the river pebbles below. Brandon could not look away. The sheer, overwhelming terror felt like a physical weight crushing his chest, freezing the air inside his lungs. He stood completely still, his headlamp trembling so badly that the beam of light danced erratically across the back wall of the cave, while his brain desperately tried to process the physical impossibility of what he was witnessing. A 4-inch crack in solid stone cannot accommodate a living creature. But then the limestone groaned again, a deep, vibrating bass sound that resonated right through the soles of Brandon's boots. A second finger emerged, then a third. The long, multi-jointed hands began to pull the edges of the vertical fissure apart. The rock wasn't breaking, it was flexing, shifting like clay under an immense, unnatural pressure from the other side. Slowly, the smooth, hairless crown of a pale gray skull began to push through the gap. The skin was slick and wet, glistening under the blue-white beam of the headlamp, completely free of any blood or tissue, despite the razor-sharp edges of the stone scraping against it. The entity was unhinging its own skeletal structure, compressing its ribs and shoulders flat to slip through a space no wider than a book. As the top half of the creature's face cleared the rock, its two massive, glassy black orbs snapped into focus. They didn't blink. They didn't adjust to the bright light. They locked instantly onto Brandon, absorbing the headlamp's glare like twin pools of ink. Its unhinged jaw slid open, and from deep within its elongated throat came a low, wet, rhythmic chattering sound, the dry clicking of bone rubbing against bone. The clicking sound echoed off the narrow walls of the gallery, magnifying until it sounded like hundreds of insects crawling inside Brandon's own ears. That sound broke Brandon's paralysis. He didn't grab his backpack. He didn't check his water bottle. He spun around on his heel, his heavy boots skidding wildly against the smooth river pebbles, and bolted down the narrow subway-like tunnel, running blindly back toward the mouth of the cave. The gallery was pitch black behind him, illuminated only by the frantic, bouncing beam of his headlamp as he ran. He sprinted through the first massive chamber, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. The air in the cave, which had felt crisp and refreshing hours earlier, now felt suffocating, smelling heavily of ancient, stagnant mud and iron. Behind him, from the darkness of the tunnel he had just abandoned, came a terrifyingly fast sound. It wasn't a running stride, it was a heavy, four-legged scrambling, a rapid succession of wet, solid impacts against the stone floor. Thump, 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 thump. The entity was moving with an insect-like velocity, its long, double-jointed limbs propelling its emaciated body across the rocks at a speed no human could ever match. Brandon reached the steep, rocky slope that led to the second chamber. He scrambled up the loose stones on his hands and knees, tearing his fingernails against the rock, his headlamp swinging wildly. He looked over his shoulder for a fraction of a second. At the bottom of the slope, just 30 feet behind him, the blue-white light caught the towering gray silhouette. It was moving on all fours, its head hanging upside down from its elongated neck, its black eyes reflecting the light with a brilliant, predatory shine. The clicking sound from its throat was deafening now, vibrating through the solid stone walls of the cavern. Brandon screamed, a sound of pure, unadulterated survival panic, and threw his body forward through a narrow archway leading to the final chamber. He knew the entrance fissure was just ahead, but he also knew the entry track required a slow, tight crawl on his stomach. If he tried to crawl, the creature would catch him before his torso even cleared the gap. He reached the base of the final limestone wall, where the horizontal fissure sat hidden behind the ferns. The cold outside air was blowing inward, smelling of fresh rain and forest earth. Brandon didn't slide into the crawlway. Instead, he grabbed his heavy digital camera, which was still securely strapped around his neck, and turned around to face the dark archway. The creature burst into the chamber, its long arms reaching out, its black claws outstretched. Brandon raised the camera, targeted the center of the dark room, and slammed his finger down on the shutter button. The high-powered external strobe flash exploded with a brilliant, blinding pop of white light, completely illuminating every single corner of the limestone cavern with the intensity of a lightning strike. The creature let out a high-pitched, metallic shriek, a sound like tearing sheet metal as the sudden, intense light hit its dilated black eyes. It recoiled violently, its long limbs buckling underneath its weight as it threw its torso backward into the shadows of the rocks to escape the glare. Brandon didn't wait for the flash to recharge. He dropped the camera, threw his body flat into the mud of the fissure, and clawed his way through the narrow opening with a frantic, desperate strength. The sharp limestone tore through his jacket and cut deep lines into his back, but he didn't stop until his head burst through the curtain of wild blackberry briars into the foggy afternoon air of the forest. He tumbled out onto the wet dirt of the ravine, scrambled to his feet, and ran blindly through the dense woods of the Daniel Boone National Forest, leaving his gear, his camera, and the cave behind him forever. 3 hours later, a search and rescue team found Brandon sitting on the shoulder of a remote logging road, covered in wet clay, his clothes torn to shreds, and his back bleeding from dozens of deep lacerations. He was shivering violently despite the mild spring air, staring blankly into the trees, completely unable to speak. The local ranger station, working alongside the Kentucky State Police, dispatched a team of 5 armed deputies to locate the coordinates of the undocumented cave the following morning. Because Brandon had left his GPS tracker inside his backpack at the terminal wall, the team was able to navigate straight to the hidden fissure in the ravine. When the deputies breached the narrow opening and moved through the subterranean chambers, they found the cave completely silent. The dry riverbed was empty, and Brandon's backpack was still sitting on the river pebbles at the very back of the gallery, untouched. But what the forensics team discovered when they retrieved Brandon's dropped digital camera near the entrance is what turned this case into a classified federal file. The camera's internal memory card was completely intact. When the technicians developed the final image, the one Brandon had taken right before escaping into the crawlway, the photograph showed the entire final chamber lit up by the strobe flash. The gray, emaciated creature was caught perfectly in the center of the frame, its torso twisting backward, its long fingers shielding its hairless skull from the light. But the photograph also revealed something the headlamp had completely missed. The creature hadn't emerged from the rock alone. In the brilliant white light of the flash, the walls of the final chamber were shown to be covered in dozens of small vertical fissures. And from inside every single one of those dark cracks, a pair of long, pale fingers was slowly reaching out into the room, meaning the mountain wasn't just holding one entity, the entire cave system was a living hive. The Daniel Boone National Forest authorities permanently sealed the entrance to the fissure 3 days later, pouring tons of solid industrial concrete into the ravine to block the gap completely. The cave was erased from all local conservation maps, and the file was handed over to a federal agency, remaining closed to the public to this day. Brandon Cole never returned to teaching biology, and he never entered the state of Kentucky again. He relocated to a high-rise apartment building in downtown Manhattan, choosing a space on the 40th floor where the ground is a distant memory and everything is constructed of steel, glass, and solid concrete. He managed to rebuild a quiet routine, but the psychological scars of that spring afternoon have never left him. He refuses to visit parks, he cannot sleep in a dark room, and he uses a high-powered flashlight for any nightly activity. Because according to Brandon, the true nightmare isn't the memory of the chase or the creature's shriek. The true nightmare lives in the knowledge of how close the dark truly is. Every time he walks past a brick wall or a cracked pavement, his eyes involuntarily lock onto the gaps. He realizes that you can be completely safe walking through a modern city with absolute confidence, entirely unaware that just inside the solid structures of the world, something is sitting in the narrow spaces, chattering its teeth, and waiting for someone to find the crack in the stone. The draw of exploring the vast, untouched wilderness of the American West is that it promises a complete escape from the constant digital noise of modern society. When you step off the paved roads and hike into the dense national forests, you are willingly trading cell service and high-speed internet for absolute solitude. For most people, this is a liberating experience, but it also means that if something goes wrong, you are entirely cut off from help. For 29-year-old freelance software developer and avid hiker Elijah Vance, a solo backpacking trip through the rugged mountains of northern Idaho in the autumn of 2018 would turn into a bizarre, bone-chilling mystery. He would discover that sometimes, even when you are miles away from civilization, a digital signal can find you, and a simple online notification can become a harbinger of pure terror. The setting for the story is the Clearwater National Forest, a massive, isolated wilderness characterized by steep, timber-covered ridges, deep granite gorges, and hundreds of miles of densely overgrown trails. It was the 14th of October 2018, a day where a sudden mountain cold front had pushed down from Canada, dropping the temperature into the low 30s and leaving a thin, ghostly mist hovering just above the forest floor. The air was incredibly crisp, smelling of damp pine needles, freezing riverstone, and the faint, cold scent of oncoming mountain snow. Elijah was an experienced outdoorsman who routinely took one-week solo trips to clear his mind from his intense coding schedule. He carried a heavy-duty tactical backpack, a high-powered aluminum flashlight, and a modern satellite communication device that allowed him to log his coordinates for safety. He was a deeply logical, numbers-driven guy who viewed the world through a lens of strict technology and facts, completely devoid of any belief in ghost stories or internet lore. Around 3:45 p.m., Elijah was navigating an unmapped rocky ridge about 8 miles deep into an isolated valley known as the Dead Man Creek Basin. The sun was dipping behind the jagged peaks, plunging the valley floor into a heavy, dark purple twilight that felt intensely quiet and oppressive. The only sound was the steady, rhythmic crunch of his own hiking boots fracturing the frozen frost on the dirt path and the heavy, controlled sound of his breathing. As he reached a narrow switchback near a steep limestone bluff, Elijah noticed a dark, horizontal opening in the base of the rock wall. The fissure was partially obscured by overgrown ferns and dry winter brush. A steady, freezing draft of air was blowing out from the gap, indicating a massive, hidden subterranean cave system extended deep into the mountain. Curious, Elijah set his backpack down, pulled out his powerful tactical flashlight, and decided to take a quick look inside the opening before setting up his camp for the evening. He squeezed his body through the narrow gap, his jacket tearing slightly against the sharp stone, until the ceiling suddenly vaulted upward into a wide, pitch-black gallery exactly 30 feet below the surface. The temperature inside the chamber dropped instantly, turning bone-chillingly cold. The atmosphere was completely stagnant, heavy, and smelled sharply of copper, oxidized iron, and ancient rotting clay. For nearly 20 minutes, Elijah walked through the pristine stone passage, using his bright white flashlight beam to guide his steps over the smooth river pebbles on the floor. The light cut through the heavy mist, creating a tiny circle of safety in the absolute dark. At exactly 4:12 p.m., Elijah reached the very back of the gallery, where the passage tapered inward and terminated in a solid wall of jagged limestone. He shined his light along the rock face, but as he turned around to head back toward the entrance, his high-powered flashlight suddenly flickered twice and died completely, plunging the entire cavern into an absolute, suffocating blackness. Elijah stopped walking. The silence inside the cave became total, absolute, and physical, so heavy that he could hear the frantic rushing of the blood in his own ears. He didn't panic. He figured the cold cave air had simply drained the battery. He reached into his pocket to pull out his smartphone, intending to use the screen's backlight to find his way out. He pressed the power button, and the screen illuminated his face in a pale blue glow. As the display turned on, Elijah's breath caught sharply in his throat. Even though he was 30 feet underground and miles away from the nearest town, the signal bar in the top corner of his phone screen was fully illuminated, showing a strong 5-bar connection to a high-speed network. Before his brain could process how this was technologically possible, a loud, sharp notification ping shattered the absolute silence of the cave. A digital map application on his phone had just sent an automated push notification asking him to rate his experience at his current location. Elijah frowned, his fingers trembling slightly as he opened the application. The screen displayed a localized map, but instead of showing the name of the national forest, the map showed a single, unnamed black circle right where he was standing. Then, from the absolute darkness at the terminal wall behind him, came a sound. It wasn't a shifting rock, and it wasn't the wind. It was a sharp, dry, rapid clicking noise. It sounded exactly like bone chattering against bone at an impossible speed, vibrating through the empty stone vault with a terrifying clarity. Click, 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 click. Elijah froze, his logical mind completely fracturing. He slowly raised his phone, directing the pale blue light of the screen toward the terminal wall. Emerging from the shadows, fully caught in the blue glare, was a face. It was immeasurably long and emaciated, its gray, leathery skin stretched so tight over the skull that the white bone structure underneath was visible through the flesh. It had no nose, no ears, and its unhinged jaw was wide open, sliding rhythmically from side to side to create that horrific clicking sound. But what made Elijah's blood turn to ice were the eyes. They were two massive, glassy black orbs that completely reflected the blue light of his phone screen, staring straight into his eyes. The creature's neck was long, thin, and twisted at a horrific 90-degree angle, causing its hairless head to hang completely upside down between its broad shoulders. Before Elijah could move, the creature launched its 7-foot frame forward, its long, double-jointed limbs propelling its body across the river pebbles with an insect-like velocity, heading straight toward the space where he was standing. Elijah scrambled backward, his boots losing traction on the smooth river pebbles as he threw himself toward the narrow entrance fissure. He squeezed his body through the stone gap in a frenzy of pure adrenaline, ignoring the sharp rocks tearing through his shirt, and tumbled out into the freezing twilight of the Dead Man Creek Basin. He didn't stop to grab his tactical backpack. He sprinted blindly down the mountain switchback, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The ghostly mist had turned thick and heavy, swallowing the pine ridges in an absolute whiteout gloom. Behind him, from the mouth of the dark cave, came a horrific crashing sound. The entity had burst through the narrow opening. It wasn't running like a human. It was moving entirely on all fours, its long, double-jointed limbs striking the frozen dirt with a rapid, rhythmic thud. Thump, 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 thump. The creature was closing the distance with an insect-like velocity, its upside-down head twitching from side to side as that dry, rhythmic chattering of bone against bone echoed through the dark timber. Elijah ran for nearly 3 hours through the pitch-black wilderness, completely lost, his legs burning, guided only by the primal instinct to survive. By the time he finally collapsed from exhaustion, he was at the edge of an old logging road. He hid inside a hollow cedar stump until dawn, his phone clutched in his bleeding hands, completely paralyzed by the fear that the gray thing was still circling the perimeter. When a passing U.S. Forest Service truck found Elijah at 7:30 a.m., he was hyperventilating, his eyes wide and unfocused, and he was completely unable to speak a coherent sentence. The Rangers transported him to the Clearwater Valley Hospital in Orofino, where doctors treated him for severe hypothermia, physical exhaustion, and deep psychological shock. His family arrived at the hospital later that evening, deeply relieved but completely baffled by what happened next. While Elijah was lying semi-conscious in his hospital bed, his close friend and emergency contact, who had stayed behind in Boise, received a bizarre notification on his computer. The notification came from Elijah's public online mapping profile. Exactly 3 days after Elijah had been rescued from the logging road, a new public review was uploaded to the digital map application for the Dead Man Creek Basin. The review consisted of a single star and a short, hand-typed description. The text read, "The air is very cold down here. You left your bag. We are using your phone now." The Clearwater National Forest authorities, accompanied by 2 Idaho State Police deputies, launched a full search of the basin over the following weekend to retrieve Elijah's missing tactical backpack. When the search team located the hidden limestone fissure at the base of the bluff, they discovered a series of disturbing physical anomalies. The narrow opening had been violently widened from the inside out. The ancient stone fractured into a jagged 3-foot-wide chasm covered in deep, parallel gouge marks that had cut straight through the rock face. Elijah's backpack was sitting just inside the entrance, but every single zipper had been cleanly sliced open, and his high-powered aluminum flashlight had been twisted into a tight metallic knot. Furthermore, when trackers attempted to follow the line of the creature's claw prints inside the cavern, they found that the passage didn't lead to a dead-end wall. The team discovered that the terminal wall had collapsed, exposing a network of deep, horizontal burrows dug directly into the vertical clay banks of an underground aquifer that connected straight to the Clearwater River system. These tunnels measured barely 2 feet in diameter, meaning the entity had been navigating the entire park system completely unseen using these subterranean waterways. The Idaho State authorities permanently closed the Deadman Creek Basin Trail Loop 3 weeks later, citing hazardous terrain conditions and a sudden spike in local wildlife aggression. The trail was removed from all official forestry maps, and the entrance was blocked by heavy timber barricades. Elijah Vance never went backpacking again. He resigned from his software developer position, sold his home in western Idaho, and moved his family to a modern high-rise concrete apartment complex in downtown Las Vegas, Nevada, a place where the terrain is completely flat, the desert sun bakes the earth dry, and the artificial lights never turn off. He managed to recover his physical routine, but the psychological scars of that October night remain entirely unhealed. He refuses to enter any dark spaces, he will not go near bodies of water, and he keeps every light in his home turned on 24 hours a day. Because according to Elijah, the true terror of the experience isn't the memory of the chase or the creature's upside-down face. The true terror lives in the realization of how deceptive the world truly is. Every time he looks out a window at night or watches a shadow shift in a corner, his body goes cold. He realizes that you can be completely in control of your life, moving forward with absolute confidence, entirely unaware that just outside the tiny circle of your safety, something impossible is standing in the dark, watching you, and waiting for your light to go out. The appeal of extreme solo night hiking is that it forces you to rely entirely on your own senses. When you are miles away from the nearest paved road, in the dead of night, the world shrinks down to the exact width of your flashlight beam. Everything outside that circle of white light does not exist. It is a liberating, intense feeling, but it also carries a terrifying reality. If you are entirely dependent on that single beam of light to see the world, you are also completely vulnerable to whatever is standing just outside the edge of the glow. For 32-year-old high school track coach Derek Vance, a late-night hike through the rugged wilderness of Western Oregon in the summer of 2021 would turn into a masterclass in psychological survival. He would find out that sometimes your light doesn't protect you from the dark, it just shows you what is waiting for you inside it. The setting for this story is the Rogue River Siskiyou National Forest, a massive ancient wilderness characterized by steep, timber-covered ridges, deep granite canyons, and miles of dense, overgrown trails. It was the 14th of August, 2021, a night where the Pacific Northwest air was heavily thick, smelling of damp cedar needles, wild ferns, and the faint, sweet scent of oncoming summer rain. Derek was an elite athlete and an experienced outdoorsman. He routinely went on night runs and hikes to clear his head, carrying a lightweight tactical backpack, a heavy-duty military-grade flashlight, and a handheld GPS unit. He was a practical, logic-driven guy who didn't believe in superstitions, ghosts, or urban legends. He viewed the forest as a gym, nothing more. Around 11:45 p.m., Derek was about 6 miles deep into an isolated loop trail called the Panther Ridge Track. The silence of the forest at this hour was total, dead, and absolute. The heavy canopy of old-growth Douglas firs blocked out the light from the stars, leaving the trail in a state of pitch-black darkness that felt almost physical. The only sound was the steady, rhythmic crunch of his own trail shoes pressing into the dry pine needles and the heavy, controlled sound of his breathing. As he reached a narrow switchback that overlooked a steep, dark ravine, Derek felt a sudden, inexplicable drop in the temperature. The warm summer air vanished, replaced by a freezing, icy draft that made his breath instantly form thick white plumes of vapor in the air. He stopped walking. He held his breath, standing perfectly still on the dirt path, listening intently. At first, there was nothing. But then, from about 40 feet down, the steep, brush-covered slope to his right, came a very distinct sound. It was a slow, heavy snap of a thick pine branch. Crack. Derek didn't panic. In Oregon, black bears and black-tailed deer are incredibly common, and they frequently forage for berries near the trails at night. He figured he had simply startled a large animal that was bedding down for the evening. He raised his heavy flashlight, aiming the 500-lumen beam down into the dark brush, expecting to see the brown fur of a deer or the white tail of an elk. He clicked the button. The brilliant white light sliced through the darkness, illuminating the jagged green ferns, the rough bark of the cedar trees, and the gray granite boulders scattered along the slope. The brush was completely empty. There was no bear, no deer, and no animal of any kind. Derek frowned, keeping the light focused on the area. He let out a short, tense whistle, trying to scare off whatever was hiding in the shadows. But the forest did not respond. The silence returned, but it felt different now. It felt heavy, deliberate, as if the darkness itself was pressing against the edges of his light beam. Derek clicked the flashlight off, returning the world to absolute blackness, and took 2 steps forward to resume his hike. The moment his shoes touched the dirt, he heard the sound again. But it wasn't down in the ravine anymore. It was directly ahead of him on the main trail, about 20 feet away, hidden just past the sharp curve of the switchback. It was a wet, heavy, sliding sound, like someone dragging a sack of wet leather across the rocks. Slide, pause, slide, pause. Derek's heart gave a sudden, violent thud against his ribs. That wasn't the sound of an animal. An animal moves with a specific 4-legged rhythm, or it crashes through the brush to get away from a human. This movement was slow, calculating, and completely unbothered by his presence. Derek raised the flashlight again, his fingers tightening around the cold aluminum casing. He snapped the beam on, directing the light straight down the center of the narrow dirt path. The white light cut through the mist, and Derek's entire body went completely rigid. Standing right in the center of the trail, fully illuminated by the high-powered beam, was an entity. It was impossibly tall, standing well over 7 feet, but its body was so emaciated that its ribs and hip bones were pushing sharply against its skin like skeletal ridges. The flesh was a dull, waxy, bruised gray color, completely hairless and glistened with a thick, clear fluid that looked like liquid mucus. The limbs were twice the length of a normal man's, its long arms dangling so low that its multi-jointed fingers, ending in sharp black claws, were scraping gently against the dirt of the path. But it was the head that made Derek's blood run completely ice cold. The creature's neck was long, thin, and twisted at a horrific 90-degree angle, causing its hairless head to hang upside down from its shoulders. It had no nose or ears, just a smooth, pale skull, but where the eyes should have been, the flashlight beam caught the brilliant, blinding reflection of 2 massive, glassy black orbs. The creature was staring directly into the light lens, its unhinged jaw wide open, revealing a series of jagged, calcified ridges running along its gums. From deep within its throat came a low, rapid, dry clicking sound, the rhythmic chattering of bone against bone. Derek stood perfectly paralyzed, the heavy flashlight shaking so violently in his hand that the circle of white light was dancing erratically across the creature's leathery chest. His logical brain completely fractured. He wanted to run, he wanted to scream, but his muscles refused to obey his commands. The creature didn't sprint toward him, it slowly shifted its weight, dragging its left leg forward with a heavy metallic scrape against the granite rocks. scrape, step, scrape, step. It was walking directly into the center of the flashlight beam, completely unfazed by the light, its upside-down head twitching rhythmically from side to side as the clicking sound from its throat grew louder and louder, filling the entire silent canyon. Derek realized with absolute certainty that if he stayed on that path for another 5 seconds, he would never leave the forest. With a desperate, breathless scream, he broke through his paralysis. He didn't turn around to run back up the mountain trail. The creature was too close, and the switchbacks were too narrow. Instead, Derek threw his body sideways, leaping straight off the edge of the trail into the pitch-black, brush-covered ravine to his left. He tumbled down the steep slope, his body slamming against sharp rocks, tearing through thick blackberry briars, and losing his grip on his heavy flashlight as he fell. The device hit a boulder, bouncing away into the darkness, its white beam pointing uselessly up toward the sky. Derek landed hard at the bottom of the ravine, the wind knocked completely out of his lungs. He lay in the cold mud, gasping for air, his clothes torn and his arms covered in deep, bleeding lacerations. Above him, from the dark trail he had just leaped from, the rapid, four-legged scrambling started. Thump, 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 thump. The entity was descending the slope, its long limbs propelling its emaciated body through the thick brush with an insect-like speed, tracking the sound of his fall. The rapid, insect-like scrambling came crashing down the slope of the ravine, snapping thick branches and tearing through the dense ferns with terrifying ease. Thump, 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 thump. The entity was moving entirely on all fours now, its long, emaciated limbs propelling its weight through the pitch blackness with a fluid, unnatural agility. Derek lay gasping in the mud, his ribs aching from the fall. The tactical flashlight he had dropped was sitting about 15 feet away, wedged against a rotten cedar stump, its brilliant white beam pointing straight up into the dense canopy of the Douglas firs. The light created a narrow, vertical pillar of white illumination in the middle of the dark ravine. Derek knew he couldn't stand up and run. His left ankle was severely sprained from the tumble, throbbing with a sharp, white-hot pain. He could hear the creature closing the distance, the heavy, wet sliding of its leathery flesh against the wet moss, and that dry, rhythmic chattering of bone against bone echoing through the trees. Click, 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 click. With no other choice, Derek dragged his body backward into the hollow, decayed underside of a massive, fallen redwood trunk just behind him. He pulled his knees tight to his chest, pressing his back against the damp, crumbling wood, and covered his mouth with both hands to muffle the sound of his frantic, ragged breathing. A second later, the creature entered the narrow pillar of light cast by the dropped flashlight. From his hiding spot in the hollow log, Derek had a clear, unhindered view. The entity walked directly into the beam, its 7-foot frame cutting through the white light. It stopped right next to the rotten cedar stump. It didn't search the ground with hands. Instead, its long, thin neck elongated even further, lowering its upside-down head until its face was just inches away from the burning LED lens of the flashlight. The two massive, glassy black orbs dilated, absorbing the intense light without a single blink. It tilted its head at that horrific 90-degree angle, sniffing the cold air, its unhinged jaw twitching as a thick, clear string of fluid dripped from its calcified ridges onto the aluminum casing of the light. Then the creature raised one of its long, double-jointed arms and slowly brought its black claw down onto the lens. Crush! The flashlight shattered, instantly plunging the entire ravine into absolute pitch-black darkness. The silence that followed was total and suffocating. Derek held his breath, his heart hammering so violently against his ribs he was certain the creature could hear it. He could smell it now, a sharp, copper-like stench mixed with stagnant river water and old rot, filling the interior of the hollow log. For 3 agonizing minutes, nothing happened. There was no movement, no sound, no wind. Then, right outside the opening of his log, Derek heard the soft, wet sliding of flesh against the mud. The creature was crawling on its stomach, circling the perimeter of the fallen redwood. It was inches away. Derek could hear the dry scraping of its black claws against the exterior bark of the very log he was hiding inside. Scrape, slide, scrape. Just as the copper smell became unbearable and a low, wet hiss vibrated through the wood right above Derek's head, a sudden, blinding flash of light cut through the trees from the ridge above. It was followed by the loud, echoing blast of a horn and a booming human voice shouting through a megaphone. A search team from the Douglas County Sheriff's Department, accompanied by volunteers from a local mountain rescue group, had just reached the switchback. Derek's wife had called the authorities when he failed to check in by midnight, and because he had an active GPS tracker on his backpack, the team had been able to pinpoint his exact coordinates. The moment the bright floodlights from the ridge cut through the canopy, the entity let out a high-pitched, metallic shriek, a sound like iron tearing apart and bolted. It didn't climb back up to the trail, it scrambled down the remaining length of the ravine, its four limbs moving with an impossible frantic speed until the sound of its clicking faded into the deep, unmapped canyons of the forest. The rescue team descended the slope with ropes and stretchers, finding Derek inside the hollow log 20 minutes later. He was hyperventilating, his hands still locked over his mouth, his eyes wide and completely unfocused, refusing to let go of a heavy, jagged rock he had grabbed to defend himself. The Oregon State Police conducted a full investigation of the Panther Ridge track over the following weekend. When a team of forensic deputies reached the bottom of the ravine to retrieve Derek's backpack and his shattered flashlight, they discovered a series of disturbing physical anomalies. The aluminum casing of the tactical flashlight hadn't just been stepped on, the heavy metal had been twisted and melted, covered in a highly acidic, clear secretion that had literally eaten through the tempered glass lens and the electronic circuitry inside. Furthermore, when trackers attempted to follow the line of the creature's escape down the canyon, they found that the wet, five-fingered claw prints didn't stop at the riverbed. The team discovered a network of deep, horizontal burrows dug directly into the vertical clay banks of the Rogue River. These tunnels were completely hidden beneath the water level, measuring barely 2 feet in diameter, wide enough only for an emaciated, boneless frame to slide through, meaning the entity had been navigating the entire park system unseen using the subterranean waterways. The Douglas County authorities permanently closed the Panther Ridge Loop Trail 3 weeks later, citing hazardous terrain conditions and a sudden spike in local wildlife aggression. The trail was removed from all official forestry maps, and the entrance was blocked by heavy timber barricades. Derek Vance never went night hiking again. He resigned from his position as a track coach, sold his home in Western Oregon, and moved his family to a modern high-rise concrete apartment complex in downtown Las Vegas, Nevada, a place where the terrain is completely flat, the desert sun bakes the earth dry, and the artificial lights never turn off. He managed to recover his physical routine, but the psychological scars of that August night remain entirely unhealed. He refuses to enter any dark spaces, he will not go near bodies of water, and he keeps every light in his home turned on 24 hours a day. Because according to Derek, the true terror of the experience isn't the memory of the chase or the creature's upside-down face. The true terror lives in the realization of how deceptive the world truly is. Every time he looks out a window at night or watches a shadow shift in a corner, his body goes cold. He realizes that you can be completely in control of your life, moving forward with absolute confidence, entirely unaware that just outside the tiny circle of your safety, something impossible is standing in the dark, watching you and waiting for your light to go out. The field of deep-sea marine biology is one of the most frustrating sciences on the planet. We have better maps of the surface of Mars than we do of our own ocean floor. When you are operating a research vessel miles away from the coast, lowering millions of dollars of delicate equipment into a black abyss that is miles deep, you are completely at the mercy of the elements. It is an environment of absolute pressure, freezing temperatures, and total darkness. But for 38-year-old oceanographer Raymond Vance, a deep-sea mapping expedition off the coast of Northern California in the spring of 2019 would throw his entire team into a state of pure psychological terror. They would find out that when you drop a camera into a trench where the sun has never shone, you might pull up a secret that science is too terrified to share with the world. The setting for this story is the Mendocino Fracture Zone, a massive, jagged, underwater canyon system that plunges over 10,000 feet into the Pacific Ocean bedrock. It was the 14th of May, 2019, a night where a massive Pacific storm had rolled over the research vessel, forcing the crew to secure the upper decks as 12-foot swells slammed against the hull. Inside the main laboratory cabin, the atmosphere was incredibly tense, smelling of stale coffee, ozone from the electronic racks, and the heavy dampness of the sea. Raymond was a highly respected researcher who had spent 15 years tracking deep-sea tectonic activity for a federal marine institute. He was a logical, data-driven man who viewed the ocean as a machine to be studied, completely devoid of mythical sea monsters or old sailor superstitions. Along with him in the dark cabin were two colleagues, an acoustics technician named Ethan and a remote vehicle operator. Around 10:15 p.m., the team was utilizing a heavy, armored deep-sea submersible camera platform called the Abyssus 4. The platform was suspended by a heavy, steel-reinforced fiber optic cable dangling exactly 9,500 feet below the surface, right along the vertical rock face of the underwater canyon. At exactly 10:32 p.m., the submersible's high-definition video feed, which was being projected onto a large monitor screen in the center of the cabin, began to suffer from severe electromagnetic interference. Horizontal lines of green static rippled across the display, obscuring the image of the jagged basalt rock walls. Raymond leaned forward, tapping the edge of the metal console, telling Ethan to check the cable tension. Ethan checked the digital gauges and shook his head, his face turning pale under the fluorescent cabin lights. The tension was perfectly normal, but the acoustic hydrophone, the ultra-sensitive underwater microphone mounted to the camera frame, was picking up a massive spike in low-frequency audio. Ethan turned up the volume on the laboratory's main monitor speakers. At first, there was only the deep, rhythmic, rushing sound of the ocean current. But as Raymond stepped closer to the speakers, the rushing sound was replaced by a sound that made his stomach drop. It was a sharp, dry, rapid clicking noise. It sounded exactly like bone chattering against bone at an impossible speed, vibrating through the deep water with an immense rhythmic clarity. Click, 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 click. Raymond frowned, stating that a sound like that at nearly 10,000 feet was a biological impossibility. Marine mammals couldn't survive the pressure at this depth, and deep-sea fish didn't possess the skeletal structures required to create a dry bone click. Before he could finish his thought, the remote operator let out a short gasp, pointing a shaking finger at the video monitor. The armored camera platform had drifted into a massive horizontal cavern opening in the canyon wall. The ultra-bright, high-intensity LED floodlights mounted to the frame cut through the black ocean water, illuminating the entrance of the cave. And standing right inside the mouth of the cavern, perfectly centered in the blue-white glare of the lights, was a shape. The creature was towering, its height estimated at well over 7 feet, but its torso was so emaciated that its rib cage and long segmented spine pushed sharply against its skin like jagged ridges. Its flesh was a dull, leathery, bruised gray color, completely hairless and glistened with a clear, thick fluid. Its double-jointed limbs were twice the length of a normal human's, its long arms ending in multi-jointed fingers with sharp black claws that were gripping the edge of the basalt rock face. But it was the head that made Raymond's heart give a violent, uncomfortable thud against his ribs. The creature's neck was long, thin, and twisted at a horrific 90-degree angle, causing its hairless head to hang completely upside down between its broad shoulders. It had no visible nose or ears, just a smooth, pale skull, but where the eyes should have been, the high-intensity floodlights caught the brilliant, blinding reflection of two massive, glassy black orbs. The entity was staring straight through the camera lens, its unhinged jaw wide open, revealing a series of jagged, calcified ridges running along its gums as it chattered its teeth to create that deafening clicking sound. Raymond stood perfectly paralyzed in the dark cabin, the green static of the monitor illuminating his face, his mind completely fractured. The creature was living at a depth where the pressure would instantly crush a human being into a pulp, yet its body was completely intact, moving with a fluid, terrifying grace. The creature didn't retreat into the cave. It slowly shifted its weight, launching its 7-foot frame off the rock face, its long limbs propelling its body through the freezing water with an insect-like velocity, heading straight toward the suspended camera platform. Raymond screamed at the remote operator to winch the camera up, his voice cracking with pure survival panic. The operator slammed his hand onto the emergency hoist control, and the heavy electric motor on the upper deck roared to life, the steel-reinforced fiber optic cable groaning under the sudden, immense strain as it began to pull the platform back up toward the surface. Through the video monitor, despite the heavy horizontal bands of green static, Raymond watched the entity close the distance. It swam with an impossible erratic motion, its long, double-jointed limbs cutting through the black ocean water like the legs of a giant aquatic spider. Before the camera platform could rise 10 feet, the screen tilted violently. The creature had reached the frame. A long, gray, emaciated arm shot into the clear view of the lens, its black claws clamping around the heavy titanium housing of the upper floodlight. The metal groaned, a sound picked up by the hydrophone and broadcast into the quiet laboratory cabin as a deep, metallic screech. The creature pulled its face right up to the lens, its massive, glassy black orbs filling the entire screen, its unhinged jaw twitching rapidly as it blasted that dry, rhythmic bone clicking straight into the microphone. The sound was so incredibly loud, it blew out the audio amplifiers in the laboratory console, filling the room with a sharp, burning smell of electrical fire. Then, the entity brought its other hand down onto the fiber optic cable connection. The monitor screen went completely black. The digital telemetry data vanished, replaced by an error message that read, "Signal lost, physical disconnect." Outside the cabin, on the storm-tossed upper deck, the heavy winch let out a horrific, high-pitched scream as the steel-reinforced cable snapped with a sound like a cannon shot. The loose end of the cable whipped through the air, smashing a heavy glass searchlight on the superstructure before spinning uselessly out into the ocean. Raymond stood perfectly still in the middle of the dark laboratory, his hands gripping the edge of the console, his chest heaving as the 12-foot swells continued to slam against the ship's hull. He looked at Ethan, whose face was completely devoid of color, his hands shaking so violently he could barely hold his clipboard. The research vessel returned to the port of Eureka, California 24 hours later, cutting the mapping expedition short due to severe equipment failure. Raymond immediately submitted his digital data logs and the partial video recording to the Regional Marine Institute director. Within 6 hours of their arrival, a team of 4 plainclothes officials from a federal science and security agency arrived at the port. They boarded the ship, confiscated the laboratory's primary hard drives, seized the remaining spools of fiber optic cable, and placed the entire crew under a strict federal non-disclosure agreement. The incident was officially logged in the public archives as a catastrophic deep-sea cable failure caused by an underwater landslide along the Mendocino fracture zone. But what the Marine Institute's internal review board discovered before the files were completely locked away is what turned this scientific observation into a classified nightmare. The acoustics technician, Ethan, had managed to save a 3-second backup of the hydrophone audio onto an encrypted personal flash drive before the federal agents arrived. When Raymond and a senior marine biologist analyzed the audio frequency in a private facility weeks later, they discovered that the dry, rapid clicking sound wasn't a random biological noise. The pattern of the bone clicks matched the exact cadence of a highly complex mathematical binary code. When translated through a standard military decryption algorithm, the repeating message inside the entity's clicking didn't contain coordinates or geological data. The short, hand-scratched translation read, "We are coming up." The federal agency permanently closed the marine coordinates around the Mendocino Cavern 3 months later, designating a 40-square-mile zone of the Pacific Ocean as a restricted military testing area, completely off-limits to commercial fishing, research vessels, and public navigation. Raymond Vance never boarded a research vessel again. He resigned from his Oceanographic Institute position, sold his home on the California coast, and relocated to a small, landlocked town in the high, arid plains of western Kansas, a place where the ground is flat dirt for hundreds of miles, the air is bone dry, and the nearest body of water is a shallow irrigation ditch. He managed to build a quiet, routine life as a high school earth science teacher, but the psychological scars of that May night remain entirely unhealed. He refuses to go near lakes or swimming pools, he cannot tolerate dark, quiet spaces, and he leaves a high-powered lantern burning on his nightstand 24 hours a day. Because, according to Raymond, the true horror of the experience isn't the memory of the creature's upside-down face or the snapping of the steel cable. The true horror lives in the realization of what is hidden beneath the surface of our world. Every time he looks at a map of the ocean or hears a faint, rhythmic chattering sound from a heating vent in his classroom, his entire body goes completely rigid. He realizes that humanity is just sailing on a thin, fragile surface of comfort, completely unaware that miles below the waves, in the absolute dark and crushing pressure of the deep abyss, something impossible is breathing, chattering its teeth, and waiting for the tide to turn. The human body is an incredibly resilient machine, but it has some very hard, non-negotiable limits. If you subject it to extreme cold, you have a very predictable window of time before hypothermia sets in, your core temperature drops, and your vital organs simply decide to turn off. When you choose to go ice fishing in the dead of winter in the northern United States, you understand this risk. You dress in heavy layers, you bring a heated shanty, and you constantly monitor the thickness of the ice beneath your boots. But for 24-year-old landscape photographer Garrett Cole, a solo trip to a frozen lake in northern Minnesota in the winter of 2021 would throw him into a situation where the cold wasn't his only enemy. He would find out that the ice doesn't just keep the water down, sometimes it traps something else entirely. The setting for the story is Lake Vermilion, a massive, deep body of water located in a remote part of St. Louis County, Minnesota. It was the 14th of January, 2021, a day where a brutal Arctic blast had pushed down from Canada, dropping the temperature to a bone-chilling -15 degrees. The wind was howling across the flat expanse of the frozen lake, creating blinding flurries of whiteout snow that completely erased the tree line on the shore. Garrett was an experienced winter outdoorsman. He had driven his four-wheel drive pickup truck out onto the ice earlier that afternoon, parking near a deep trench where he knew the winter pike liked to congregate. He had spent the last 2 hours drilling an 8-inch hole through the 20 inches of solid blue ice, setting up his portable insulated pop-up shelter, and turning on a small propane heater to keep the interior space livable. By 6:30 p.m., the winter darkness had fully arrived. The world outside his nylon shelter was an absolute freezing void, dominated only by the roaring wind. Inside, the amber glow of a battery-powered lantern cast long, flickering shadows against the fabric walls. Garrett sat on a folding bucket seat, staring down into the dark, circular hole in the center of the ice, watching his fishing line dangle into the black water below. The contrast was hypnotic. A small circle of liquid water surrounded by a frozen desert. At exactly 6:52 p.m., the propane heater let out a sharp sputter and died. Garrett cursed softly, his breath instantly forming a thick white cloud in the sudden chill. He reached down to check the gas valve, but before his fingers could touch the metal regulator, he heard a sound. It didn't come from the wind outside, and it didn't come from his truck. It came from directly beneath him, inside the ice itself. It was a heavy, dull thud. Thump. Elijah froze. In the winter, frozen lakes make a lot of noise. As the temperature drops, the ice expands and contracts, creating massive, booming cracks that sound like cannon fire echoing across the water. It is a completely normal, albeit unsettling, phenomenon. Garrett expected to hear the familiar laser-like ricochet sound of a pressure crack traveling across the lake. But this wasn't a crack. 3 seconds later, the sound happened again right at the edge of his ice hole. Thump, thump. It sounded exactly like something heavy and solid striking the underside of the 20-inch ice shelf from the water below. Garrett stood up, pulling his heavy gloves on, and grabbed his powerful tactical flashlight. He approached the edge of the hole, bending over slightly, and shined the bright white beam straight down into the water. The light penetrated the first few feet, illuminating the suspended particles of organic matter floating in the current before fading into the deep, black abyss of the lake. The water was perfectly still. Garrett shook his head, thinking a massive lake sturgeon or an oversized northern pike had simply swum up to investigate his bait and bumped into the ice. He turned away to grab his spare propane tank from the corner of the tent. As his back was turned, a sudden violent spray of freezing water erupted from the hole, splashing against the back of his heavy canvas jacket. Garrett spun around, his heart instantly hammering against his ribs. The water inside the 8-inch hole was sloshing back and forth erratically, overflowing onto the slushy ice floor of the shelter. But there was no fish on his line. The line was completely slack. Then, Garrett noticed a change in the ice surrounding the hole. The blue, solid ice had a slight transparency to it when illuminated by his lantern. And right beneath the surface, about 3 inches down into the frozen shelf, was a dark shape. Garrett dropped to his knees, pressing the lens of his tactical flashlight flat against the ice to cut through the surface glare. The white light illuminated the interior of the frozen block. Moving slowly through the solid ice, just inches beneath Garrett's knees, was a hand. It wasn't a human hand. The fingers were immeasurably long, thin, and skeletal, with gray, leathery flesh that looked completely waterlogged. The nails were pointed and black, scraping against the frozen interior with a faint, muffled ticking sound that resonated through the floor. Tick, tick, tick. Garrett let out a breathless gasp, scrambling backward until his spine hit the vertical support poles of his shelter. His mind refused to accept what his eyes were seeing. The hand was inside the ice. Not in the water beneath it, but actually embedded within the frozen molecular structure, moving through the solid mass as if it were swimming through thick mud. The dark shape moved with a sickening fluid grace, traveling in a circle around the perimeter of the fishing hole. Garrett realized with absolute certainty that whatever this thing was, it was using its claws to score the underside of the ice, systematically weakening the shelf directly beneath his folding chair. Before he could even reach for the zipper of the tent door, the ice beneath his shelter let out a horrific, splintering scream. A massive starburst fracture ripped through the center of the floor. The 8-inch fishing hole instantly collapsed outward, expanding into a jagged 3-foot chasm of black water. The sudden shift in weight caused Garrett's folding bucket seat, his tackle box, and his lantern to slide into the hole, vanishing into the lake with a heavy splash. The shelter tilted violently to the left, the nylon fabric tearing away from the frozen anchors in the wind. Garrett lunged forward, his gloved hands clawing at the slippery edge of the intact ice shelf as his legs dangled into the freezing 40-degree water below. The cold hit his lower body like an electric shock, instantly paralyzing his thigh muscles and stealing the air from his lungs. He struggled to pull himself up, his heavy winter boots filling with water, dragging him down like anchors. As he kicked his legs frantically in the dark water, trying to find a purchase against the submerged wall of the ice shelf, something brushed against his right ankle. It was a firm, freezing grip. A set of long, skeletal fingers closed tightly around his boot, pulling downward with an immense, steady pressure. Garrett screamed into the empty tent, his fingers slipping against the wet, slushy surface of the lake ice as he was dragged an inch lower into the black water. He reached out with his right hand, his fingers scrambling in the dark until they closed around the handle of his metal ice chisel, a heavy, 3-foot steel bar with a razor-sharp edge used to clear ice from the hole. Garrett hoisted the heavy iron bar with his remaining strength and drove the sharp tip straight down into the water near his legs. The metal struck something solid. A muffled, high-pitched screech echoed through the water, vibrating right through the soles of his boots. The freezing grip on his ankle instantly released. Garrett didn't wait. He threw his upper body onto the solid ice shelf, crawling on his belly like a seal, hauling his waterlogged legs out of the chasm just as the entire pop-up shelter collapsed into the hole behind him. He lay on the open ice, fully exposed to the -15-degree wind, his clothes instantly freezing into a stiff, solid armor of ice. He was completely blind in the dark, his lantern gone, the whiteout snow stinging his eyes. About 50 feet away, the headlights of his pickup truck were still cutting through the blizzard, representing his only chance at survival. Garrett attempted to stand, but his legs were completely numb from the thermal shock. He began to drag his body across the frozen expanse, using his elbows to pull himself through the snowdrifts toward the truck. Behind him, from the dark chasm where his tent had been, came the sound of something heavy dragging itself out of the water onto the surface of the lake. It was a wet, rhythmic, slapping sound against the solid ice. Slap, drag, slap, drag. The sound wasn't staying by the hole. It was moving through the blizzard, tracking the line of Garrett's scent in the snow, accelerating with every passing second. The wet, rhythmic, slapping sound against the solid ice was closing the distance fast. Slap, drag, slap, drag. Through the roar of the -15-degree wind, Garrett could hear a low, rattling click, like frozen teeth chattering together at an impossible speed. He didn't look back. Looking back would mean slowing down, and a delay of even a single second meant death. He dragged his frozen, heavy body forward, his elbows scraping raw against the crusted snow, his eyes locked entirely on the twin beams of his truck's headlights cutting through the whiteout blizzard. He reached the driver's side door, his fingers completely stiff and losing all sensation from the advanced stage of frostbite, fumbled brutally with the frozen door handle. He pulled it with everything he had left, and the heavy metal door swung open, casting a warm, interior yellow glow over the snow. Garrett rolled his body over the threshold into the cab, collapsing onto the floorboards before hauling his leaden legs inside. He slammed the door shut, hit the power locks, and shoved the keys, which were thankfully already in the ignition, forward. The V8 engine roared to life, the heater instantly blowing a faint wisp of lukewarm air into the cabin. Garrett pulled himself up onto the bench seat, his entire body shaking so violently he could barely look straight ahead. He wiped the frost from his eyes and looked out the driver's side window into the blinding sheet of snow. Standing just 5 feet away from the truck, directly in the path of the headlights, was the entity. In the sharp, blue-white glare of the high beams, Garrett could see it with terrifying clarity. It was nearly 7 feet tall, its gray, leathery torso so emaciated that its spine pushed sharply against the skin of its back. It had no clothes, no hair, and its long, multi-jointed limbs were dripping with black, freezing lake water that turned into instant icicles as it hit the air. Its head was elongated, featuring no nose or ears, and its face was dominated by 2 massive, glassy black orbs that completely absorbed the truck's headlights. Its unhinged jaw was wide open, revealing those same jagged, calcified ridges Garrett had felt through the ice, twitching rapidly from side to side to create that horrific clicking sound. The creature didn't attack the vehicle. It slowly raised one of its long, skeletal arms, its black, pointed claws scraping gently against the driver's side glass pane. Screech. Then, it tilted its head at an impossible angle, its black eyes locking directly onto Garrett through the glass, and it let out a low, wet, gurgling hiss that vibrated right through the metal frame of the truck. Garrett, consumed by pure, unadulterated survival panic, slammed his foot down onto the gas pedal. The 4-wheel drive tires spun violently against the thick ice, screaming for traction before the studded rubber finally bit into the snow. The pickup truck lunged forward, swerving erratically across the frozen expanse of Lake Vermilion. Garrett didn't follow the ice road, he just drove blindly toward the faint, distant lights of the shoreline highway, terrifyingly aware that the creature had vanished into the blizzard behind him. He reached the boat launch ramp 20 minutes later, his truck bouncing violently over the frozen shoreline rocks before hitting the safety of the salted asphalt of Route 77. He drove straight to the nearest emergency room in Virginia, Minnesota, where he was immediately admitted for severe hypothermia and advanced stage 2 frostbite on his feet and fingers. The St. Louis County Sheriff's Department launched a full investigation into the incident the following afternoon after Garrett was stabilized. A team of 3 deputies, accompanied by a local wildlife officer, drove out onto the ice to locate Garrett's abandoned equipment and assess the site of the ice collapse. When they located the coordinates of the starburst fracture, they found the portable shelter completely submerged inside the 3-foot chasm of black water, frozen solid into the ice shelf as the temperature had dropped overnight. But what the deputies found on the surface of the ice surrounding the chasm is what turned this file into an absolute psychological horror. There were no human footprints in the snow other than the deep troughs left by Garrett's elbows as he dragged himself to his truck. However, spanning a 300-foot radius around the open water, the ice was covered in hundreds of the long, 5-fingered skeletal claw marks. The marks didn't just lead away from the hole toward the truck. When the wildlife officer used a high-powered ice-penetrating radar to map the structure of the frozen shelf beneath the snow, he discovered that the entire 20-inch layer of ice for 50 yards around Garrett's fishing spot had been systematically hollowed out from below. Something had spent weeks using its claws to carve a massive subterranean network of horizontal tunnels inside the solid ice shelf channels that were just wide enough for an emaciated, leathery body to swim through, hidden completely from the view of anyone standing on the surface. This meant that the entity hadn't just chanced upon Garrett's fishing hole that evening. It had been living inside the ice shelf itself for months, moving silently beneath the feet of dozens of winter fishermen, listening to the vibrations of the augers, and waiting for someone to sit alone in the dark after the sun went down. Despite an extensive sweep of the lake by state conservation officers over the next 2 winters, the entity was never seen again. The case remains an open, unsolved mystery in the St. Tep Tess. Louis County Archives categorized officially as an unexplained ice hazard and structural failure. Garrett Cole spent 3 weeks in the hospital, narrowly avoiding the amputation of his toes. He sold his landscape photography business, sold his truck, and left the state of Minnesota entirely within a month of his release. He relocated to a small town in the high, arid desert of New Mexico, where the ground is baked dry by the sun and water is a luxury found only in pipes. He managed to build a new life, but the psychological residue of that Arctic night has never left him. He refuses to travel north during the winter, he won't enter a cold room, and he uses only hot, running water for any daily activity. Because according to Garrett, the true nightmare isn't the memory of the freezing water or the creature's black eyes. The true nightmare lives in the knowledge of what lies beneath the surface of things. Every time he walks across a wooden floor or a tiled room, his body tenses up. His ears listen intently for the faint, muffled sound of something clicking against the supports from below, and he realizes that you can be completely safe, walking through your life with absolute confidence, entirely unaware that just 3 inches beneath your feet, something is waiting for the ice to break. The draw of exploring deep subterranean cave networks is that it forces you to confront a world that is completely alien to human existence. When you are hundreds of feet below the surface, the familiar rules of the upper world cease to apply. There is no concept of day or night, no cellular network, and no ambient warmth. If your main light source fails, the darkness that swallows you is so absolute that you can literally lose your sense of balance and direction within minutes. But for 34-year-old wilderness guide Austin Briggs, a solo exploration into an undocumented cavern in the rugged backcountry of southern Missouri in the autumn of 2015 would turn into a masterclass in psychological survival. He would discover that when you venture into the deepest, most isolated corners of the earth, the dark isn't always empty. The setting for this story is the Ozark National Scenic Riverways, a massive expanse of dense timber, steep limestone bluffs, and thousands of hidden, unmapped sinkholes. It was the 12th of October 2015, a day where the crisp autumn air was thick, smelling of dry oak leaves, damp moss, and the faint, cold scent of river limestone. Austin was a highly disciplined outdoorsman. He spent his free time mapping minor cave entries for a regional geology group always carrying a tactical backpack, a heavy-duty 3-battery headlamp, and a secondary high-powered flashlight. He was a practical, level-headed guy who didn't believe in superstitions or campfire stories. To him, a cave was just an interesting rock formation, nothing more. Around 3:45 p.m., Austin was navigating a deep, rocky ravine about 5 miles off the main hiking trails when he noticed a small horizontal opening at the base of a towering limestone bluff. The fissure was partially obscured by a thick curtain of wild vines and overgrown ferns. A steady, freezing draft of air was blowing out from the gap, a clear sign that it connected to a massive, hidden underground chamber. Austin unbuckled his pack, pushed it ahead of him through the muddy opening, and squeezed his torso through the narrow gap. The sharp rock tore at his jacket, but after a few yards of tight crawling, the ceiling suddenly vaulted upward into a magnificent, pristine cavern. The air inside was dead, freezing, and heavy, registering at a constant 54 degrees. The only sound was the slow, rhythmic dripping of water striking the pebbles somewhere in the deep dark. Drip. Pause. Drip. For the next 2 hours, Austin moved deeper into the cave system, completely fascinated. He followed a dry, ancient underground riverbed that twisted through 3 massive chambers, each one larger and darker than the last. The blue-white beam of his headlamp cut through the heavy mist, illuminating majestic white stone pillars and ancient mineral deposits. At exactly 5:50 p.m., Austin reached a long, narrow gallery that resembled a subway tunnel. The floor was covered in smooth, dark river pebbles, and the walls tapered inward until they terminated in a solid wall of jagged stone. Austin set his backpack down on a dry, flat boulder, intending to take a quick rest before starting the long trek back to the surface. The silence in the room was total, absolute, and suffocating. Then, from the darkness at the very back of the gallery, about 30 feet ahead of him, came a sound. It wasn't a water droplet, and it wasn't a shifting rock. It was a slow, heavy, wet, sliding motion against the damp clay. Slide, pause. Slide, pause. It sounded exactly like someone dragging a massive sack of wet leather across the pebbles. Austin froze, his muscles locking up as his adrenaline spiked. He slowly raised his right hand, gripping his secondary high-powered flashlight, and snapped the 500-lumen beam straight toward the back wall. The brilliant white light sliced through the gloom, and Austin's entire body went completely rigid. Crouching right in the far corner of the terminal wall, fully illuminated by the glare, was an entity. It was impossibly tall, standing well over 7 feet, but its body was so emaciated that its ribs and elongated spine pushed sharply against its skin like jagged ridges. The flesh was a dull, waxy, bruised gray color, completely hairless, and glistened with a thick, clear fluid that looked like liquid mucus. Its double-jointed limbs were twice the length of a normal human's, its long arms dangling so low that its multi-jointed fingers, ending in sharp black claws, were buried deep into the gravel. But it was the head that made the breath catch sharply in Austin's throat. The creature's neck was long, thin, and twisted at a horrific 90-degree angle, causing its hairless head to hang completely upside down between its shoulders. It had no visible nose or ears, just a smooth, pale skull, but where the eyes should have been, the light beam caught the brilliant, blinding reflection of 2 massive, glassy black orbs. The creature was staring straight into the lens, its unhinged jaw wide open, revealing a series of jagged, calcified ridges running along its gums. From deep within its throat came a low, rapid, dry clicking sound, the rhythmic chattering of bone against bone. Click, 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 click. Austin stood perfectly paralyzed, the heavy flashlight shaking so violently in his hand that the circle of white light was dancing erratically across the creature's leathery chest. His logical brain completely fractured. The creature didn't retreat from the light. It slowly shifted its weight, dragging its left limb forward with a heavy, solid impact against the stone. Thump, step, thump, step. It was moving directly into the center of the beam, its upside-down head twitching rhythmically from side to side as the clicking sound from its throat grew louder and louder, filling the entire silent gallery. Austin realized with absolute certainty that if he didn't move immediately, he would never see the sun again. With a breathless scream of pure survival panic, Austin dropped his secondary flashlight, turned around, and bolted down the narrow subway-like tunnel, running blindly back toward the mouth of the cave. Behind him, from the dark gallery, the rapid four-legged scrambling started. Thump, 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 thump. The entity was descending the slope, its long limbs propelling its emaciated body through the narrow passages with an insect-like velocity, tracking the heavy vibration of his escape. Austin sprinted through the dark, twisting passages, his heavy boots skidding wildly over the loose, damp stones of the ancient riverbed. The blue-white beam of his headlamp bounced frantically up and down, illuminating the sweating limestone walls and the massive white stalactites that seemed to reach down like teeth from the ceiling. The air in the cave had turned hot and suffocating, carrying that sharp, copper-like stench of old rot and stagnant water that filled his throat with every frantic gasp. Behind him, the sound of the pursuit was gaining ground. It was a heavy, fluid, four-legged scrambling that vibrated right through the stone floor of the tunnel. Thump, 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 thump. The entity was moving with an impossible, insect-like velocity, its long, double-jointed limbs propelling its emaciated body across the rocks without a single slip. Austin reached the second massive chamber, a vaulted room where the trail split into two different tunnels. In his panic, he couldn't remember which path led back to the entrance. He paused for a fraction of a second, his headlamp sweeping across the dark openings. That microsecond of hesitation almost cost him his life. From the tunnel behind him, the creature burst into the chamber. It didn't stay on the floor. With a sudden, terrifying leap, it launched its 7-foot frame onto the vertical limestone wall, its black claws digging deep into the stone with a sharp, shattering sound. It began to scamper horizontally across the rock face, heading straight for the archway where Austin was standing. Click, 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 click. Austin let out a breathless cry, dove to his right, and threw himself into the narrower of the two openings. He scrambled forward on his hands and knees as the ceiling dropped down to a height of just 4 feet, forcing him into a tight, claustrophobic trench. He could hear the creature arrive at the entrance of the trench behind him. Because of its massive 7-foot height, it couldn't immediately sprint into the narrow gap. It let out a high-pitched metallic shriek, a sound like iron tearing apart that echoed off the stone walls so loudly it shattered the lens of Austin's headlamp. The light died instantly. The world vanished into absolute pitch-black darkness. Austin froze, his chest pressed flat against the cold, damp mud of the trench floor. The silence that followed was total, suffocating, and heavy. He covered his mouth with both hands, trying to muffle the frantic, violent sound of his own breathing. He could hear the creature right at the mouth of the trench, just 10 feet away. It was unhinging its bones. The dry, rhythmic cracking of its joints echoed through the dark as it compressed its torso and shoulders inward, slowly sliding its emaciated body into the narrow opening. Scrape. Slide, scrape. A thick, clear drop of its fluid fell from the ceiling of the trench, landing right onto the back of Austin's exposed neck. It was ice cold, smelling sharply of sulfur and old river clay. With no light and no space to run, Austin reached out into the dark, his fingers desperately searching the mud until they closed around a heavy, sharp limestone shard that had broken off the wall. He gripped the rock, holding it tight against his chest, preparing to fight for his life in the dark. Just as the copper smell became completely overwhelming and a low, wet wheeze vibrated through the air right next to his boots, a sudden bright beam of white light cut through the trench from the far end. A loud, booming voice echoed through the passage. A regional search and rescue team, accompanied by 2 backcountry rangers, had just entered the front chamber of the cave. Austin had left a detailed map of his entry coordinates on the dashboard of his truck at the trailhead, a standard safety protocol he never neglected. When his truck was found abandoned past the park's closing time, the rangers had immediately initiated a sweep of the ravine. The moment the powerful searchlights hit the interior of the trench, the entity recoiled. It let out another wet, gurgling hiss, pulled its long limbs backward out of the gap, and scrambled down into a deep, vertical drainage fissure in the floor of the second chamber, vanishing into the unmapped depths of the aquifer below. The rescue team pulled Austin out of the trench 20 minutes later. He was hyperventilating, his clothes covered in white clay, his hands locked completely rigid around the limestone shard, refusing to let it go until he was safely inside the back of the ambulance. The Missouri Department of Conservation conducted a full structural safety review of the ravine over the following week. When a team of specialized cave rangers descended into the undocumented entry to retrieve Austin's abandoned gear, they discovered that the vertical drainage fissure where the creature had escaped didn't lead to a dead end. The fissure connected straight to a massive subterranean network of flooded conduits that ran for miles beneath the entire Ozark River system. And when the team analyzed the limestone walls around the junction, they found thousands of the long five-fingered claw marks carved deeply into the stone face, worn smooth by years of water flow. Something had been utilizing the dark, flooded passages of the state park to navigate beneath the feet of millions of unsuspecting tourists, campers, and boaters for generations, completely hidden from the upper world. The state authorities permanently closed the rocky ravine 3 weeks later. A heavy construction crew used industrial explosives to collapse the entrance bluff, burying the horizontal fissure under hundreds of tons of solid limestone boulders, erasing the entry from all official park directories. Austin Briggs never entered a cave again. He resigned from his wilderness guide position, sold his home in southern Missouri, and relocated to a modern high-rise apartment complex in downtown Chicago, Illinois, a place where the ground is covered in miles of solid pavement and the artificial lights of the city never turn off. He managed to rebuild a quiet indoor routine, but the psychological scars of that autumn afternoon remain entirely unhealed. He refuses to enter basements, he cannot tolerate dark rooms, and he leaves a high-powered flashlight on his nightstand 24 hours a day. Because according to Austin, the true horror of the experience isn't the memory of the chase or the creature's upside-down face. The true horror lives in the realization of how fragile our safety truly is. Every time he walks across a tiled floor or hears a faint, rhythmic scratching sound from inside a wall vent, his body goes completely cold. He realizes that humanity is just living on a thin, fragile crust of reality, entirely unaware that deep within the deep dark of the world, something impossible is breathing, chattering its teeth, and waiting for the next light to go out. The draw of utilizing a massive metropolitan subway system is that it offers a perfectly predictable, synchronized way to navigate the chaotic underbelly of a major city. Every single day, millions of commuters step onto these subterranean platforms, swipe their transit cards, and board steel transit cars that hurtle through dark, brick-lined tunnels at 60 miles per hour. It is an environment defined by routine, public crowds, and a complete reliance on transit security. But for 36-year-old night shift transit security monitor Marcus Briggs, a late-night surveillance rotation at a major underground junction in Brooklyn, New York, in the spring of 2022 would turn into a horrifying demonstration of how fragile that security truly is. He would discover that a closed-circuit television monitor can capture an event that completely defies the laws of physical reality, and that some passengers who board the train at midnight have absolutely no intention of ever stepping off. The setting for the story is the Hoyt-Schermerhorn subway station, a deep, multi-level transit knot located beneath downtown Brooklyn. It was the 24th of April, 2022, a night where a bitter, unseasonable spring downpour had flooded the street gutters above, forcing a thick, heavy humidity down into the lower concrete platforms. The air inside the underground station was stagnant, chilly, and smelled intensely of hot steel brakes, damp concrete, and the faint, chemical scent of old garbage rot. Marcus was a highly disciplined, 9-year veteran of the Transit Authority's security division. He sat in a dimly lit, locked surveillance booth on the upper mezzanine level, surrounded by a massive wall of glowing monitors displaying live feeds from 40 different platforms and tunnel junctions. He was a practical, data-driven man who viewed the subway system as a giant mechanical grid completely devoid of any belief in urban legends, ghost trains, or underground superstitions. Around 1:15 a.m., the heavy rush of late-night commuters had completely dwindled away, leaving the deep lower platforms in an eerie, absolute silence. Marcus leaned forward in his mesh chair, sipping a cup of black coffee, his eyes tracking the live feed of Platform 4, which serviced the late-night local trains heading toward the outer boroughs. At exactly 1:32 a.m., a vintage, faded silver transit car pulled into the empty station, its heavy brakes letting out a long metallic shriek that echoed through the tiled tunnels. The pneumatic doors slid open with a loud mechanical hiss, revealing a completely dark, unlit passenger compartment. Sitting perfectly still on the center orange bench of the dark car was a lone passenger. He looked like a 30-year-old man wearing a heavy, dark canvas jacket, his head bowed down toward his chest. Marcus tapped his keyboard, zooming the high-definition security camera closer to the train window to see if the passenger was experiencing a medical emergency. As the digital lens adjusted its focus, the smile completely vanished from Marcus's face. The image on his monitor was perfectly sharp, but the anatomy of the passenger was completely wrong. The man's canvas jacket was loose, but underneath the fabric, his torso was so incredibly emaciated that his ribs and an elongated, segmented spine pushed sharply against his clothing like jagged ridges. His skin, visible around his collar, was a dull, leathery, bruised gray color, completely hairless and glistened with a thick, clear fluid that looked like liquid mucus. His double-jointed arms were twice the length of a normal human's, his long, multi-jointed fingers ending in sharp black claws that were buried deep into the fiberglass structure of the bench. But it was the head that made the breath catch sharply in Marcus's throat. The passenger's neck was long, thin, and twisted at a horrific 90-degree angle, causing his hairless, pale skull to hang completely upside down between his shoulders. He had no visible nose or ears, but where the eyes should have been, the infrared sensor of the security camera caught the brilliant, blinding reflection of two massive, glassy black orbs. The entity was staring straight into the surveillance lens, its unhinged jaw wide open, revealing a series of jagged, calcified ridges running along its gums. Marcus sat perfectly paralyzed in the dark security booth, the pale blue glow of the monitor screens illuminating his face. His logical brain tried to reject it. He watched the digital timer on the screen tick forward. The train doors remained open for exactly 30 seconds, but nobody stepped off and nobody boarded. Then, from the desktop audio monitor on Marcus's console, which broadcast the live audio feed from the Platform 4 microphone, came a sound. It wasn't the low hum of the train's generator, and it wasn't the wind rushing through the shafts. It was a sharp, dry, rapid clicking noise, the rhythmic chattering of bone against bone at an impossible velocity. And as Marcus watched in absolute, unadulterated horror, the creature slowly shifted its weight off the orange bench. It dropped onto all fours, its long, double-jointed limbs moving with a fluid, spider-like velocity as it compressed its entire 7-foot frame flat against the floor of the train car, heading straight toward the open sliding doors. Marcus realized with an absolute terrifying certainty that if that door closed and the train moved into the dark transit tunnels, the entity would be loose within the core infrastructure of the city. He slammed his hand onto the emergency radio button, his voice cracking with pure survival adrenaline as he ordered the platform conductor to hold the train and seal the lower platform gates. The mechanical chattering from the intercom speaker accelerated, growing so loud that the audio amplifiers began to clip and hiss. The entity slid out of the dark car, its long limbs propelling its body across the wet concrete of Platform 4, moving directly toward the base of the security booth's stairwell. Marcus did not wait for the creature to reach the top of the stairs. He lunged across the control console, slamming the switch down. A series of thick, reinforced steel security grates dropped from the ceiling with a deafening crash, sealing the security booth behind a solid metal barrier just as a heavy impact rattled the outer walls. Through the glass viewing window, Marcus could see the steel grates vibrating under a succession of rapid, violent strikes. The entity was on the other side of the glass, compressed flat against the vertical concrete wall of the mezzanine corridor. It brought its hands up against the glass partition, its long, black, calcified claws scraping against the smooth surface with a slow, agonizing shriek. Screech. Then, the desktop audio monitor on his console erupted into a chaotic mess of sound. The creature opened its unhinged jaw wide, and a voice came out of the speaker. It was a perfectly flat, mechanical male tone, repeating Marcus's own security badge number and his full name over and over again in an identical dead loop. Officer Marcus Briggs. Officer Marcus Briggs. Monitor station closed. The sheer, psychological horror broke Marcus's mind. He backed away from the console, his knees giving out as he collapsed onto the concrete floor of the booth, covering his ears with both hands to block out the rhythmic chattering of bone against bone that followed. The New York City Transit Police and a heavily armed tactical response unit arrived at the Hoyt-Schermerhorn station at approximately 2:15 a.m., initiating a full lockdown of the entire transit line. When the tactical sweep team entered the upper mezzanine level with high-powered searchlights, the corridor was completely quiet. The humid air smelled intensely of copper, hot grease, and a thick, sulfur-like chemical rot. The passenger was completely gone. The reinforced steel security grates outside Marcus's booth were deeply dented, covered in thick, parallel gouge marks that had sliced straight through the metal coating. What the Transit Authority's internal engineering team discovered when they analyzed the structural telemetry of the station's lower tunnels is what caused the entire deep platform level to be permanently sealed from the public within 72 hours. The investigators found that the creature had ripped open a heavy iron ventilation grate located directly beneath the third rail on Platform 4, cutting straight into a massive, forgotten network of unmapped maintenance tunnels that ran parallel to the active subway lines for miles. The old brick walls of the forgotten grid were completely covered in thousands of long, five-fingered claw marks worn smooth by years of subterranean movement. The creature hadn't just boarded the train that night. It had been utilizing the forgotten, abandoned transit networks constructed during the early development of the city to navigate beneath the feet of millions of unsuspecting Brooklyn residents for decades, traveling from borough to borough completely undetected. Furthermore, when the digital analysts recovered the backup data from Marcus's terminal before the power failure, they realized the vintage silver transit car hadn't suffered an electrical glitch. The diagnostic log showed that the internal lights of the car had been drained by a massive localized electromagnetic draw, meaning the entity was naturally capable of manipulating electrical infrastructure simply by accelerating the rhythmic clicking of its own skeletal joints. The Metropolitan Transportation Authority permanently closed Platform 4 of the Hoyt-Schermerhorn station 3 weeks after the incident. A specialized construction crew used 500 tons of industrial concrete to wall off the lower tunnels completely, pouring liquid cement into the ventilation shafts and erasing the platform from all future transit maps and public directories. Marcus Briggs never monitored a security screen again, and he never rode a subway train again. He resigned from his position at the Transit Authority, packed his belongings into a U-Haul truck, and relocated to a small single-story home in the flat, sun-baked desert of western Texas, a region with no underground transit, no deep tunnels, and absolutely no subterranean infrastructure. He managed to build a quiet daytime routine as a rural delivery driver, but the psychological scars of that April night remain entirely unhealed. He refuses to enter any building with a basement, he cannot tolerate dark, enclosed rooms, and he leaves a high-powered tactical lantern burning on his nightstand 24 hours a day. Because according to Marcus, the true horror of the experience isn't the memory of the chase or the creature's upside-down face, The true horror lives in the realization of what is riding right beneath us. Every time he hears a faint, muffled rumble from the ground or watches a shadow shift near a floor vent, his entire body goes completely cold. He realizes that humanity is just walking on a thin, fragile crust of concrete and asphalt, entirely unaware that deep within the ancient, forgotten foundations of the city, something impossible is breathing, chattering its teeth, and waiting for the next passenger to step off. The appeal of extreme underground exploration is that it forces you to face a completely absolute kind of darkness. When you are hundreds of feet below the surface of the Earth, there is no ambient light from the stars, no distant rumble of traffic, and no cellular connection to the outside world. If your equipment fails, or if you lose your way, the silence that settles around you is so heavy it can drive a person completely insane. But for 28-year-old hydrogeology graduate student Owen Vance, a solo mapping expedition into an abandoned zinc mine in northern Illinois in the spring of 2016 would turn into a horrifying confrontation with something that science could not explain. He would discover that a single photograph, taken in a place where no sunlight has reached for millions of years, could capture a living nightmare. The setting for this story is the rural outskirts of Galena, Illinois. It was the 12th of May, 2016, a cold, rainy Thursday where a relentless spring downpour had turned the rolling hills into a sea of thick mud. The air outside was heavy and damp, but down inside the forgotten shafts of the Blackjack mine, the atmosphere was completely stagnant, freezing, and smelled sharply of oxidized iron, wet clay, and ancient rot. Owen was an incredibly meticulous researcher. He was working on his master's thesis, documenting the water quality in flooded, historic mine workings across the Midwest. He carried state-of-the-art gear, including a waterproof tactical backpack, a high-grade digital camera with a powerful detachable strobe flash, and a dual-battery headlamp that could throw a beam of white light for over 200 feet. Around 2:15 p.m., Owen descended the rusted iron rungs of the main air shaft, stepping off onto the floor of the mine's third level, exactly 300 feet beneath the surface. The old timber supports groaned under the immense weight of the earth above, and the only sound was the steady, rhythmic dripping of groundwater pooling in the dark, narrow tunnels. Drip, pause, drip. For nearly 3 hours, Owen walked through the desolate, stone-walled drifts, taking water samples and using a laser distance meter to map the dimensions of the passages. The blue-white beam of his headlamp cut through the heavy mist, illuminating the old rusted tracks where ore carts used to run over a century ago. At exactly 5:10 p.m., Owen reached a remote, dead-end tunnel at the very back of the third level. The passage terminated in a massive, ragged cavern where a portion of the ceiling had collapsed decades earlier, creating a steep mountain of shattered limestone boulders that blocked any further progress. Owen set his backpack down on a dry wooden crate, pulled out a fresh bottle of water, and decided to take a series of wide-angle photographs of the collapse site to include in his thesis presentation. He mounted his camera onto a lightweight tripod, adjusted the focus toward the top of the boulder pile, and connected his external strobe flash. He pressed the shutter button. The powerful strobe flash exploded with a brilliant, blinding pop of white light, completely illuminating the massive cavern, the jagged limestone blocks, and the dark, deep recesses of the ceiling with the intensity of a lightning strike. The light vanished instantly, returning the room to the narrow, steady beam of his headlamp. Owen walked over to the tripod, looking down at the small LCD preview screen on the back of his camera to review the quality of the shot. As the digital image rendered on the screen, the smile completely vanished from Owen's face. The photograph was perfectly sharp. It showed the mountain of shattered limestone and the rotten timber framing of the ceiling. But crouching right near the very top of the boulder pile, fully illuminated by the white glare of the strobe, was a shape. The anatomy was completely wrong. It was a towering, skeletal entity, its body so emaciated that its ribs and elongated spine pushed sharply against its skin like jagged ridges. The flesh was a dull, leathery, bruised gray color, completely hairless and glistened with a thick, clear fluid that looked like liquid mucus. Its double-jointed limbs were twice the length of a normal human's. Its long arms ending in multi-jointed fingers with sharp black claws that were buried deep into the limestone dust. But it was the head that made the breath catch sharply in Owen's throat. The creature's neck was long, thin, and twisted at a horrific 90-degree angle, causing its hairless head to hang completely upside down between its broad shoulders. It had no visible nose or ears, just a smooth, pale skull. But where the eyes should have been, the camera flash had caught the brilliant, blinding reflection of two massive, glassy black orbs. The creature was staring straight into the camera lens, its unhinged jaw wide open, revealing a series of jagged, calcified ridges running along its gums. Owen stood perfectly paralyzed in the dark tunnel, the small screen of his camera illuminating his face in a pale blue glow. His logical brain tried to reject it. He told himself it was a shadow, a trick of the light against the sharp angles of the broken stone. He slowly raised his head, his hand shaking violently as he directed the bright blue-white beam of his headlamp toward the top of the boulder pile. The rocks were completely empty. There was nothing but gray limestone and deep, silent shadows. Owen let out a ragged, trembling breath, trying to calm his racing pulse. He reached down to turn off his camera, intending to pack his gear and leave the mine immediately. Then, from the darkness at the top of the boulder pile, came a sound. It wasn't a rock shifting, and it wasn't the wind. It was a low, rapid, dry clicking noise, the rhythmic chattering of bone against bone, click, 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 click. And as Owen watched in absolute, unadulterated horror, the two massive, glassy black orbs materialized out of the dark, hovering just above the topmost boulder, reflecting the beam of his headlamp with a cold, predatory glare. The creature began to slide down the rock pile, its long limbs moving with a fluid, insect-like velocity, heading straight toward the floor of the tunnel. The rapid, chattering sound accelerated as the creature descended the loose rocks, its long, double-jointed limbs moving in a chaotic, spider-like scramble that sent a mini avalanche of gray limestone pebbles rattling down onto the tunnel floor. Owen completely broke. He didn't try to fold his tripod or pack his samples. He turned on his heel and sprinted down the narrow, pitch-black drift, his boots splashing violently through the cold orange mine water that pool-flooded the floor. The tunnel was a claustrophobic nightmare. The blue-white beam of his headlamp bounced wildly off the sweating rock walls and the rotten timber supports that looked ready to collapse under the pressure of the earth. The air felt incredibly thick, turning hot and suffocating, carrying that sharp, copper-like stench of stagnant river water and old rot that filled his throat with every desperate breath. Behind him, from the dark cavern, the sound changed. It wasn't just a scramble anymore. It was a heavy, wet, sliding motion, followed by the solid, rhythmic thud of four emaciated limbs striking the mine floor at an impossible speed. Thump, 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 thump. The entity was tracking the heavy vibration of his footsteps through the water, closing the distance with an insect-like velocity. Owen reached the junction of Level 3's main tracking line, his lungs burning, his chest heaving. He knew the main airshaft, his only way out, was still about 200 yards away. He looked over his left shoulder for a fraction of a second as he rounded the bend. Just 30 feet behind him, fully caught in the trailing edge of his headlamp glare, was the entity. It was crawling on all fours, its long, leathery gray torso compressed flat against the rusted ore tracks, its thin neck twisted at that horrific 90-degree angle. Its upside-down face was fixed directly on him, its unhinged jaw wide open as a clear, viscous fluid dripped from its calcified ridges into the muddy water. Owen screamed a raw sound of pure survival terror and pushed his legs to their absolute limit. He reached the base of the main airshaft, his hands slamming against the cold, rusted iron rungs of the vertical ladder that led 300 feet up to the surface. He began to climb, pulling his weight upward with a frantic, adrenaline-fueled strength. He was 10 feet up, 15 feet up, 20 feet up, his boots slipping against the wet iron bars. Below him, the clicking sound stopped. Owen stopped climbing for a split second, looking straight down into the black void of the shaft. The creature was standing at the base of the ladder, its 7-foot frame fully illuminated by the downward beam of Owen's headlamp. It didn't try to climb the rungs like a human. It slowly tilted its hairless skull back, its two massive glassy black orbs dilating as they absorbed the intense white light without a single blink. Then, with a sudden fluid grace, it leaped straight onto the vertical rock wall of the shaft, its black claws digging deep into the solid granite face as it began to scamper upward like a massive gecko, heading straight for his heels. Owen scrambled up the remaining rungs, his hands raw and bleeding from the rough iron, his mind fracturing into total madness. He could hear the creature's claws ripping through the rock just inches below his boots. Scrape, snap, scrape. As Owen reached the final 10 feet of the shaft, where the iron rungs met the concrete collar of the surface opening, his head burst through into the cold, rainy night air. The relentless spring downpour hit his face, but he didn't stop. He threw his upper body over the concrete lip, tumbling onto the thick mud of the Galena hillside. He didn't look back into the hole. He scrambled to his feet, running blindly through the torrential rain toward his utility truck, parked a quarter-mile away near the main access road. He dove into the driver's seat, locked the doors, and slammed the keys into the ignition, his body shaking so violently he could barely steer as he tore away from the abandoned mine site. The Joe Daviess County Sheriff's Department received Owen's panicked report at approximately 6:30 p.m. He was hyperventilating, his clothes covered in orange mine clay, and his hands were completely lacerated from the rusted ladder. The responding deputies, seeing the sheer state of shock on the young researcher's face, organized a tactical search team consisting of 4 armed officers and a mine safety expert to secure the location at dawn. When the team arrived at the Blackjack mine the following morning under a gray, overcast sky, the site was completely quiet. The rain had stopped, leaving the rolling hills heavy with mist. 2 deputies, armed with tactical shotguns and high-powered searchlights, descended the main air shaft to retrieve Owen's abandoned digital camera and inspect the 3rd level. When they reached the dead-end tunnel, they found Owen's lightweight tripod sitting in the mud. The aluminum legs had been completely bent and twisted into a tight metallic knot, and his waterproof backpack had been torn to shreds, its contents scattered across the floor. But what the state mining investigators discovered when they pulled the digital camera's memory card is what caused the entire site to be permanently condemned within 48 hours. The camera had captured a final automated exposure right before Owen dropped it. The image showed the vertical rock wall of the shaft looking straight down from a height of 20 feet. The gray, emaciated entity was caught perfectly by the infrared focus assist light, its long limbs splayed across the stone face, its upside-down head staring directly up into the lens. But when the image technicians magnified the dark background of the 3rd-level tunnel behind the creature, they realized they weren't looking at empty stone drifts. Slinking out from the deep, dark recesses of the old collapsed boulder pile were 4 other distinct gray silhouettes, their double-jointed limbs unfolding from the shadows, their glassy black eyes reflecting the infrared light like a cluster of predatory spiders. The mine wasn't a forgotten ruin, it was an active underground nest. The Illinois Department of Natural Resources permanently sealed the Blackjack Mine air shaft 3 weeks later. A construction crew blasted the upper concrete collar, collapsing the vertical shaft inward before pouring 50 tons of liquid industrial concrete over the opening, burying the entrance under a thick, permanent barrier. Owen Vance never finished his master's thesis, and he never entered an underground structure again. He sold his research equipment and relocated to a modern concrete slab home in the flat, arid plains of West Texas, a region with no old mines, no deep shafts, and absolutely no history. He managed to rebuild a quiet daytime routine, but the psychological scars of that rainy May afternoon remain entirely unhealed. He refuses to go near basements, he cannot tolerate dark, enclosed spaces, and he leaves a high-powered flashlight on his nightstand every single night. Because according to Owen, the true horror of the experience isn't the memory of the chase or the creature's upside-down face. The true horror lives in the realization of what is sitting right beneath our feet every time he hears a faint, muffled vibration from the ground or watches a shadow shift near a vent. His body goes completely cold. He realizes that humanity is just walking on a thin, fragile crust of dirt, entirely unaware that deep within the ancient, forgotten foundations of the world, something impossible is breathing, chattering its teeth, and waiting for the next light to go out.